Reports
So
from
these
select
are,
committees.
these are
I'm sorry.
documents to be
I beg
laid.
your pardon. Reports from select committees. Questions to ministers. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions related to the business or sitting of the Senate and moved by a minister.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of Standing Order 45-2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that Standing Order 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Standing order is therefore accordingly suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I first want to move the introduction of the following, well, first of all, the withdrawal and the replacement of a bill that is currently on our order paper, which is it is cited at this time as the Utilities order number four, Utilities Amendment Bill. It is incorrectly cited and should therefore be actually cited as the Utilities Regulation Amendment Bill. And so I wish to withdraw the bill that is currently before us and replace it solely for the purpose of having the correct citation in the title. I need to do another one. I also beg to, okay.
The question is that the bill that stands as order number 4, which has had an incorrect citation, be withdrawn and replaced by the bill with the correct citation, but otherwise equal in all parts. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice also of the following resolution, a resolution to approve the Barbados Physical Development Plan as amended at 2023. Mr. President, I therefore beg to move that this resolution be read a first time.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I now beg to move that the Utilities Regulation Amendment Bill be read a first time.
The question is that the Utilities Regulation Bill be read first time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The bill is therefore read first time. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, it would be remiss of me to go any further beyond this point, and I wanted to dispense with business at this point before I went any further. But, Mr. President, it is very difficult for me to attempt to continue during the course of this debate to refer to you as Mr. President. Just a few days ago, last week, at the end of the month, you were conferred the nation's highest honors. And I wish in this setting, Mr. President, to refer to you for the first time in a public setting as the Most Honorable Reginald Farley, President of the Senate of Barbados. The last time I believe I was here last sitting of the Senate, I was overseas on government business, and the sitting before that, I recognized you as having been the recipient of the highest order of the Barbados Labour Party, and now you have been recognized for your service to public service, your contribution to public service, and your long-standing contribution to, I would say, Christchurch generally, and the country nationally, because that is reflective of your service. But I also personally, Mr. President, want to express my own appreciation because I happen to be responsible for a ministry that you have been in the past in the international business sector responsible for, and you continue even now in this stage of your contribution to national service to deliver great value to the people of Barbados, particularly on issues relating to international business and anti-money laundering. Congratulations to you, Mr. President, the most honorable Reginald Farley.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummins. I really appreciate it, and it's a humbling experience. For me, it is really just perhaps a little acknowledgement that I haven't been doing badly so far, but it is more an encouragement to do even more. Thank you very much for the recognition.
Public business.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 4, sir. Order number 4, in the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Utilities Amendment Bill, Regulations Amendment Bill 2023.
Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let me give notice at the outset that I'm going to take my time on this bill and go through it in some great detail. Not because the bill is a substantial one, it is actually one paragraph, but because the circumstances that have brought us to the point where the amendment is necessary is one which is worthy of detailed elaboration. So I want to start, first of all, Mr. President, by making reference to the existing legislation, which is before us, the Legislation Utilities Regulation Amendment Act. We currently have legislation before us, Mr. President, that is being amended at paragraph 37, clause 37, Mr. President, specifically, and there is a new paragraph being added at paragraph 5. In the existing legislation, and I'm very thankful to the Office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel, who has been in a position to draft this text and who has shared the consolidated text with our ministry's officials, and therefore who undertook the responsibility for doing the legislative drafting, Mr. President. The language that is before us in order number 4 on our order paper, Mr. President, reads as follows. It says, the minister may, on the recommendation of the commission or on his own initiative, exempt the supply of electricity from a renewable energy resource by a renewable energy producer from the application of all or any of the provisions of this act, where the minister is satisfied in all circumstances that the exemption is required in the public interest. Now, Mr. President, at paragraph 4 of the existing legislation, this exists already in the legislation as it relates to the utility service providers. In paragraph 3 of the existing legislation, Mr. President, the language already also exists as it relates to utility service providers. There is nothing new or extraordinary about the amendment being made to this legislation except the circumstances that are leading to it. And here's what is true, Mr. President. I think in many instances, in every discussion that we have in this parliament as legislators, we talk about the effluxion of time. We talk about how circumstances change over time and how where we started evolves over time and circumstances change, and we have as legislators to respond to those changes. When this legislation was first drafted, Mr. President, there would have been no contemplation of a renewable energy sector as it stands now in 2023. When this legislation was first drafted, it was responding to where we were at the time. When paragraph 4 of the existing legislation was introduced in 2019, Mr. President, it responded to the circumstances as they were then. But what are we dealing with now? What is the current state of the renewable energy sector? It is not, for sure, in a state of emergency. I say that without ambiguity. It is not. What I can say is that I am proud to be a Barbadian who sits among a people who must always overachieve. We talk about Barbadians punching above its weight, punching above our weight as a country. We talk about Barbadians always doing more than the standards that are being set by others. Barbados has one of the, if not the most ambitious energy transition targets, not in the Caribbean, Mr. President, not in the region, Mr. President, not in the hemisphere, in the Americas, Mr. President, but in the world. And it is the reason why Barbados is being pursued and is engaging with some of the most advanced countries in the world, because Barbados has emerged in the renewable energy space as a global leader. But I say that at a very high level, but I want to get into the specifics. Mr. President, in 2019, when the Barbados National Energy Plan was developed, it was accompanied by 2021 by an Integrated Resource Resilience Plan. That Integrated Resource and Resilience Plan, Mr. President, outlined what we call the energy mix, how much we're going to get from solar, how much we're going to get from wind in terms of megawatts, how much storage we needed to put on the system, whether or not we were going to have onshore wind or offshore wind. It rationalized what was meant to be, in 2021, a roadmap for the renewable energy sector as it was then. Mr. President, what would you say if I said to you that in 2023, actually in 2022, when I joined the ministry at the end of October, and by November, when I started to immerse myself and with the technical team in what we actually had as the then state of play, that we were still very much on target to exceed the expectations as at 2022 that were set in 2021. So it would come, therefore, as no surprise, Mr. President, that I had to make the decision in 2022 to not only, one, in March of this year, move from having a 2019 National Energy Plan to having a partnership with the United Nations Special Envoy for Energy and Sustainable Energy for All, an entity based out of Vienna, Austria, to update our National Energy Plan at 2019. The world, and Barbados with it, or ahead of it, I should say, moved so rapidly that a document finalized and touted as ambitious in 2019 had been exceeded by the time 2022 rolled around. And so March, we had a national consultation, we brought the sector together, and we kicked off the updating of the energy plan, and we began the process of creating the Barbados Energy Transition Investment Plan, which gave us a roadmap, or is giving us a roadmap, an implementation plan for the energy sector. But we didn't stop there, Mr. President. That was in March. By August, the 2021 IRRP was also outdated. And why? Because, Mr. President, the 2021 period up to now, again, Barbados overperformed. That's actually a good problem to have. So what happened, Mr. President? We had, in the energy mix, or the 2021 IRRP, we had an expectation that Barbados would have an aggregate of 280 megawatts of solar PV on the grid by 2030. I want to repeat that because that's the baseline for where we are. 280 megawatts of solar PV by 2030. Today, Mr. President, I am proud to be able to say that I come from a people who, by the end of 2022, had approved over 206, but I should say end of 2020, middle of 2023, we had approved 206 megawatts of solar PV. So if 280 is the outer limit by 2030, and by 2023, we are at 206 megawatts, we already have a problem. But it went further, Mr. President, because in the pipeline of applications, 206 is just what is approved. In the pipeline of applications, we have 333 megawatts, Mr. President. In the pipeline, in development, but not yet in application, Mr. President, we have over 450 megawatts. So if for 2030 targets, we expected to hit 280 megawatts of solar, and we at 2023 are already at 450 in the pipeline and 206 approved, Mr. President, we needed to take action to be able to ensure that the supply of PV from independent power producers beyond the utility could be connected to a grid which had a maximum capacity, Mr. President, of 100 megawatts. And that maximum capacity of 100 megawatts, this is mathematical, even though it is very technical and is energy related, it is also basic mathematics as well. So if the grid can only carry 100 megawatts, Barbadians have come into the market and investors have come into the market all the way up to 450 megawatts, Mr. President, then there has to be additional action taken. Now, the 2021 IRRP estimated that in order to allow for the energy mix of the 280 megawatts of solar PV, we needed to have 206 megawatts of battery storage. The evolution of battery storage, Mr. President, has not kept pace with the introduction of solar PV. And to date, on island, at utility scale, we still, in 2023, have only 5 megawatts of that total 206 that we need. 5 megawatts, Mr. President. Those 5 megawatts are located at the Trent facility owned by the Barbados Light and Power in St. Lucie. That is the only battery storage we have in this country. And that 450 megawatts of solar PV that is queuing up to get on the grid is gridlocked. It simply cannot get onto the grid unless there is the addition of battery storage. And I believe I've explained in a couple of forums, and I want to take the time to explain it here. If we were to onboard beyond the 100 megawatts capacity, and let me break that down slightly further. As at yesterday, December 12th, we had 91 megawatts of solar PV already on the grid. Already on the grid. So we are not, I don't even want to say we are at capacity. We are at 91 capacity, and I say that I don't want to say we are at capacity because that 91 megawatts does not include the 10 megawatts owned by the Barbados Light and Power, which is already at their Trent facility. It doesn't include it, Mr. President. So even if I were to get into the weeds of that small facility, we still have a gap between 91 and 450 megawatts to close. Of solar PV. We still have a gap, Mr. President, of between 5 megawatts of storage and 206 megawatts to close. But I go further, Mr. President. We undertook in 2023, in August, we began the work of updating the 2021 IRRP. We sat with the consultants and with my technical team that is, in Jamaican terms, there are some things that you have to use colloquialisms to describe. The best way you could describe it, and since cricket is ongoing in the region and so on, little but tallow, the small but mighty. I don't have a whole lot of officers to do a lot of the technical work. We don't have a whole lot of people to do all the things that we would want to have resourced. But they're doing some serious technical work to be able to find pathways forward. Now, someone said to me the other day, I don't envy you guys. You guys are rewriting the playbook because the playbook for this hasn't really been written in full yet. You're now crafting a new way forward because that gray area as to how we are going to onboard this additional storage to unlock the capacity of Barbados' renewable energy sector is what is occupying significant amounts of attention at this time. So what did we do? We sat down, Mr. President, with the team, the consultants, and we undertook to look at a range of things. Okay, so we know what is in the pipeline already approved. We know what is in the development stage, Mr. President. But we also wanted then to get a sense of what else is there. Homeowners' right to renewable energy, Mr. President. HOPE, for housing, Mr. President. You've heard in the public space talks about what's happening in the sugar industry, Mr. President. You've heard in the tourism sector talking about infrastructural development, the public sector investment plan, the public sector investment program specific to new infrastructure projects right there on the pier head, for example. So if we can foresee that nationally there is a raft of investment in infrastructure that is going to come down the pipeline over the next few years, what will be the country's energy needs? We went through the transportation sector, Mr. President. Electric buses, we're very proud of having electric buses, but in order for them to work in the way we want them to work, there must be solar PV. So if we commit to expanding the transportation fleet, we need to be able to have additional capacity. But the transportation fleet, as it stands now, Mr. President, is only largely the National Transport Board. We have completed the transitioning of the private service vehicles, public service vehicles, privately owned. The next large tranche, Mr. President, of transportation to be transitioned to renewables, Mr. President, is the hired car fleet. Those who are in the hired car business, they have to be able to get onto renewables. We have 150,000 cars in this country to transition as well, Mr. President. Will we get there? We don't know if we'll get there, but we're just looking at total demand capacity. What is driving this demand? And so we could not plan as at 2021, as was the existing IRRP. We had to look at just 2023, a baseline, and project all the way ahead as far as we can see and anticipate that in the same way that rapid changes have evolved between 2019 and the National Energy Plan and 2021 and the IRRP, that the expectation is that changes will continue to evolve over time. And we had to plan. And so the IRRP, which is still in the final stages of development, is already estimating that the storage needs over and above 206 megawatts as projected in 2021 is in excess of 300 megawatts of battery storage needed. I want to let that sink in for a moment because the mammoth responsibility, therefore, of a country, of a government, is to ensure that it is able to implement its own ambitious plans, its own plans for 2030. And to empower those who have come into the space to be able to deliver on their commitments. So what did we undertake to do, Mr. President? As I already outlined, we undertook to update in partnership with the United Nations Special Envoy for Energy, Sustainable Energy for All out of Vienna, Austria, the Energy Transition Investment Plan. We have a company, a consulting company that has done significant work all around the world and here in Barbados as well to update the IRRP. Working in collaboration with the University of the West Indies out of St. Augustine, we have drafted and completed a renewable energy hosting capacity study, which tells us what the total capacity could look like. We have worked with the Commonwealth Secretariat, Mr. President, with funding from the Indian Development Corporation to be able to complete a local content policy, Mr. President, and that is working its way through the system and having it finalized. And bringing it home to what we're doing here today, we then also worked with the Inter-American Development Bank over the course of the last year to begin the process of looking at what is now being discussed in the public space, competitive procurement frameworks. With the Inter-American Development Bank, Mr. President, we undertook to look at what was the framework. Initially, it was contemplated for ocean technologies. 2022, we started to look at it for ocean technologies, and then all of a sudden we decided, well, hold on, this is applicable also to storage. In July then of this year, Mr. President, and I was discussing it in an industry meeting yesterday. You know when you see on TV the red phone when it rings, you know you gotta answer it. It means SOS, Houston, there is a problem. I happen to have the benefit of having great relationships with a ton of international partners who have worked with us over time. And I have a red line in a WhatsApp chat that when it goes off, we don't send good mornings in it, we don't send hi, how you doings in it. If that particular chat goes off, there's an SOS. So in July of this year, that chat went off. That chat went off because we have an issue with storage, Mr. President. And the International Financial Corporation of the World Bank flew down here to Barbados in days. They came down, they brought their storage experts from the World Bank and their expertise from around the world, and they worked with us to create a storage strategy for Barbados. That strategy, Mr. President, introduced me to 3 concepts. One of them was not unfamiliar, one which we already have in operation. Feed-in tariff regimes. We already have a feed-in tariff regime. It works. Everyone has a rate of return. The first movers were able to come in then, and then you have those that came in afterwards at a different rate. And so that is what has brought, that's 450 megawatts of solar PV into the system, the attractiveness of feed-in tariffs. But then in the report from the IFC said this: the advantage of a feed-in tariff is that it incentivizes nascent sectors. It gets investment crowded in quickly, early, when the sector is still in development. I don't think that, given what I have outlined and described, that anyone would argue that Barbados' solar PV sector is still nascent. It is very much in a state where investment has very much been crowded in. Investors have come in, individuals have come in, householders have come in, homeowners have come in, even businesses have come in. So we've gone past the initial stages of crowding investment in and investing it in and incentivizing it in the way that it starts before. Then the IFC strategy gave us 2 additional methodologies that are used in more mature stages of the market: competitive procurement and direct negotiations. What the government then was able to do through the consultancy with the Inter-American Development Bank was to develop competitive procurement. Mr. President, I will make a document of the House, the decision of the Fair Trading Commission on the issuance of rates for solar panels, for solar PV, and for storage systems between 1 and 10 megawatts. And I made that a document of the House, Mr. President, because contained in that document is a specific reference that reads as follows: the feed-in tariff regime will continue until such time as a competitive procurement framework has been developed. This came from the feed-in tariffs, the FTC's own reporting. So from the FTC side, feed-in tariff regimes will continue in the pilot program until such time as we move to competitive procurement. So the IFC outlined the roadmap. The next stage is competitive procurement. The FTC's decision on systems between 1 and 10 megawatts said that it will continue until there is competitive procurement. But we didn't stop there, Mr. President. In October of this year, I was at a conference in Abu Dhabi. And while there, I was invited to speak at a couple of things, and I did so. And I believe I've said so even in this honorable chamber, Mr. President. I took the opportunity at the time to make reference to the fact that we in Barbados were having such difficulties with storage. And what were the difficulties, Mr. President? Not only were we having difficulties getting the storage into the country through the utility, but we had supply chain issues. 200 megawatts of battery storage in principle may sound big to us in Barbados, but not when countries like Brazil and others are ordering a gigawatt. We end up at the back of the queue. And I took the opportunity, Mr. President, while in Abu Dhabi, to make reference to what this country did during COVID, during the COVID-19 pandemic, where we could not procure supplies, medical supplies for the country because larger countries with larger volumes and more investment in the research and development and innovative technology were in the queue ahead of us. They were ordering what they wanted at the volumes that they needed, and our orders were being pushed to the back, Mr. President. A country like Barbados was finding itself waiting in the queue for storage, and in a minute I'll come to the other items that we also struggled to get, for over 18, and in some instances the outer limit of 24 months. We struggled. I cannot tell you how many licenses of existing application holders, how many existing licenses of existing licensees that I had to extend because of difficulties getting transformers, inverters, and yes, the inability to procure battery storage. We made a decision as a cabinet because the legislation allowed under ministerial order for all of those persons who by no fault of their own could not complete their RE projects on schedule. They could no longer meet the requirements of their existing license to commission their projects within a certain time frame. And so the result was we as a cabinet issued a public decision that we would extend all existing licenses through December 2025 in order to give license holders the opportunity to complete their projects. That's what we had to do, Mr. President. So gridlock. We had to unlock the grid, pun intended, Mr. President. And so we then decided in these speeches in Abu Dhabi, I made a call at the time for the issues relating to renewable energy and countries like ours to be treated to in the same way that we did vaccines and pandemic supplies, so that we were able to form an alliance with partners who would be able to ensure access to global supply chains and to be in a position where we could get access to the kind of equipment and technology that a country like Barbados needed, because our ambitions were high and we had exceeded where we had projected to be. And I don't think that anyone would have accounted for a pandemic in the middle of that transition period. And so we had to rationalize what the next steps were. Coming out of that, Mr. President, we were then approached by the entity that is working on our Energy Transition Investment Plan, SE for All, the UN Special Envoy for Energy, that said to me, Lisa, have a look. I want to introduce you to some people. And one morning, she introduced me to an entity called the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, GIAP. It's not a fly-by-night anywhere in any corner of a country. Instead, it is a philanthropic grouping backed by 3 entities. Who are the 3 entities? The Rockefeller Foundation, the IKEA Fund, and the Bezos Fund. 3 names that I don't have to go into any details because I think when you hear those names, everybody knows who they are. And those 3 entities have decided to back this entity called GIAP. And through GIAP, they work with countries that have difficulties just like ours. They're philanthropists, their philanthropy is philanthropy, and so there's no return on investment for them, they're not vested in it, but it is reflective of the work of those entities like Rockefeller, Bezos, and the IKEA Fund that give to worthy causes. They capitalized GIAP at the level of $2 billion in the first instance, and they have been working with large economies to be able to capitalize it further. Barbados was not one of the, but the first country to participate in GIAP. And through GIAP with the Rockefeller team, we then began to explore what we had already been seeing from the IFC, what the FTC had already written about, and what the technical team in the ministry had already been working on. And Rockefeller and their team took it to a different level. And so we have now, in the margins of COP last week, Prime Minister Motley launched Barbados's partnership as the first 10, among the first 10 countries in the world to be a partner country in GIAP. First 10 countries in the world. What will this allow us to do given the challenges that I have identified before? 1, Mr. President, and perhaps most importantly, it allows Barbados to find itself as part of a pooled procurement arrangement and get to the front of the queue in partnership with Rockefeller, Bezos, and IKEA Fund through GIAP to be able to access battery storage. But it doesn't stop there. It allows us to access battery storage, Mr. President, from the leading manufacturers in the world. So there is technology, and some in here know that the technology is not just lithium-ion, because in the 2021 IRRP, it spoke to 2 different types of storage devices. One, lithium-ion, and the other one is pumped storage, hydrogen storage. But the world has evolved. There's all kinds of technology now for battery storage that is commercially feasible, commercial grade. In some instances, it is more expensive, but also we are still going to be at the back of the queue. The alliance with GIAP allows us, therefore, Mr. President, to be able, one, to engage in pooled procurement, but two, to engage directly with world leaders in storage technologies as part of that alliance to be able to access world cutting-edge technology. That's where we have now gone, Mr. President. We have not attempted to do this in our own right, because what we're conscious of, Mr. President, is that we don't manufacture any of these devices in country. We don't produce them here, we import all of them, and so we needed to build relationships with the international partners. So the time will come, Mr. President, we expect where Barbados would have solved its current challenges with storage, but inevitably, Mr. President, quite frankly, will find itself having to deal with other challenges of a different kind. So you have to plan for it because you can't always foresee it. Can't always foresee it. And even if we were to get storage into the ecosystem now, Mr. President, does that solve all the problems? It can't. You still have to be able to solve for the other issues that are in the ecosystem. Regulatory lag, which is what I will come to next. I have already said that Barbados has this ambitious policy. The policy pushes us into a space where 450 megawatts of solar PV is already on the grid, is already on the system, in the pipeline, not on the grid. But what are the regulatory frameworks that govern that, Mr. President? That is the second area on which we will be working with Rockefeller. They will be embedding here in Barbados, and this is something that the Cabinet has already agreed to, so I can feel free to make the announcement here in this forum. The Cabinet has already agreed that in the partnership, we will therefore have embedded here in Barbados a world-class storage expert for a period of a year, paired with junior experts in the ministry and in the Fair Trading Commission to be able to build local capacity. Because the notion of paying consultants to come from overseas all the time to do all of the work goes against the grain of local content development. We have to be able to use the skills we have and take advantage of countries that have done this identical work before us. So we will have an expert embedded here in Barbados, and we're hoping to have that done in January of 2023. And then we will have 2024, and we will be able to collaborate with them with local expertise. We also, Mr. President, are working through Rockefeller as part of an industry technology working group. Now, what does that mean, Mr. President? We hear about technology and how it evolves usually after the fact because we're not sitting at the table. Through the partnership with GIAP, we will be sitting at the table with our partners being in a position to hear what is happening. And the other part of it, Mr. President, is that GIAP will also allow us to work along with these global partners to ensure, Mr. President, that where there's the opportunity for grant financing as well as concessional financing for Barbados to achieve its renewable energy goals, that we are in a position to benefit from that. We hope, Mr. President, that the collaboration between the World Bank, the IFC, the IDB, GIAP, Rockefeller, Bezos, and IKEA, that the collective resources that we also have here in our stakeholders in Barbados, because together with the stakeholders, we have facilitated all of the representative groups, whether it is BRIA, the Barbados Bankers Association, all of them, we have connected them with, we have not sat at the table by ourselves, Mr. President, and I want to be clear that engagement has been continuous. We had, as recently as yesterday, a full sector consultation with the entire renewable energy sector, and over the course of the last few months, we have met with every single independent power producer, with all of the regulatory agencies to be able to identify what are the bottlenecks in the system, what are the problems for which we have to solve. And you know what they said to me in one of those cases, Mr. President? They said, well, Minister, some of these things we anticipated would happen. Some of these things we saw would happen down the line. I said, okay, so we're solving for them now. So I want you to do something else for me. I want you to tell me where you see can come down the line already based on where you sit in your different respect, in your different regard, from different perspectives. The Barbados Renewable Energy Association, Where do you see us going? Where do you see the challenges coming? The Barbados Bankers Association, who have also been incredibly supportive, because the banking sector has close to, and I think we were discussing it yesterday, over $1 billion lined up in RE investments. So we have worked with them to ensure that, one, they are also updated on where we are going on storage so that they can unlock credit arrangements. But we've also been sensitive, Mr. President, to the fact that there are many people who have started projects, cannot get connected to the grid, have already had credit extended from a commercial institution, and we don't want any action to be taken against them because they're servicing their debts from their existing resources, but not from the grid as they would have envisioned. And the bankers have been working with our renewable energy partners in that regard, the independent power producers specifically. Equally so, Mr. President, the utility, we have also connected them because, as we all know, they have to procure, and they have made it public, an application for 90 megawatts of battery storage on the utility side over the next 3 years. All of the stakeholders have sat at the table of international partnerships with us. When in July we met with the IFC, we had all the partners in, including the bankers, utilities, BRIA, all of the partners. When we've been engaging with Rockefeller and GIAP, they've also been in the meetings. In some instances, I'm not even in the meetings, but they're meeting at a technical level, and I see the outputs. We met with the independent power producers. There are over 35 projects in the country. Over a certain size, we met with all of them, Mr. President. In the room, at the time, over 3 days of meetings, we had the Fair Trading Commission, the Electricity, Light and Power Committee, does all of the licenses and approvals, Town and Country Planning to deal with regulatory approvals, all of the agencies that are responsible for regulatory management sit at the table with us because policy coherence is important, Mr. President. We can't put ourselves in a position where we don't bring everybody to the table. We can't bring everybody to the table all the time, not 100% of the time, but 95% of the time we make sure that we do. There's some times where we'll have to make a decision as a government to govern. We will have all the views on the table, and then we will make a decision. But what I will say to you is that we have clear guidance from all of the partners that I have just outlined for us working with, that the next phase of acquisition for storage resources is competitive procurement. We did not come up with it ourselves either, Mr. President. The Inter-American Development Bank worked with us in a consultancy to be able to develop the competitive procurement framework. That's one. As part of the competitive procurement framework, Mr. President, we have initial expressions of interest. We have a request for a proposal. We have the standard procurement processes that are used under any standard procurement approach. We met also with the Ministry of Finance and the Procurement Department to make sure that this was in alliance with what is already in place in legislation. We did that also. We didn't just come up with this overnight. And so the notion that we are rushing this through at the 11th hour because people are distracted does not give full credence to the fact that the amount of work has gone into it to bring us to this stage. It just happens to culminate. No, because we have to unlock the grid, Mr. President. We could not have done all that I have described to you, Mr. President, if we were rushing this through the system. We could not have come to this place, Mr. President, if this was a mad rush. Could not have. Not possible. We have, Mr. President, also in the generation side, power purchase agreements that have to be negotiated with independent power producers for generation. And that has been in negotiation for some time. Under this consultancy, Mr. President, we got in front of that. And we have the consultants look around the globe. And we have with us now a draft of a power purchase agreement also for storage. Mr. President, it's there. It's there. The most competitive pricing, Mr. President, is also where I'm going to go next. I want to make it clear in this honorable chamber to all who sit here and all who can hear my voice. I am not just the minister with responsibility for energy. My ministry happens to be the ministry called the Ministry of Energy and Business. I am the Minister for Consumer Affairs, Mr. President. I am the Minister for Business, Mr. President, as well as the Minister for Energy. So I can do nothing in my ministry that is opposed to the interests of any of those entities, not for energy, not against the consumer, not against business. But I also have to be conscious, Mr. President, that for competitive pricing for storage, I have to find the best possible pricing globally, because you don't produce it here, right? You gotta be bringing it in. So we gotta find the most competitive pricing. So again, the Inter-American Development Bank working with us, and they have brought in one of the big four companies who is working with us. They have been working, and I believe that even as I speak, the teams are meeting. They are working on what is included in the outcome of the IDB study on something called a price cap. If you look on the international scene and you assess what the prices are, and you go out for a request for quotations, as the Barbados Light and Power Company already did, and they have a sense of what the prices are globally for cutting-edge technology or what Barbados needs based on its technical specifications, you will come up with a best price. And on the basis of what Barbados needs and the pooled procurement that we can work through with Rockefeller, the IDB and Deloitte specifically, they are working on a price cap mechanism for Barbados. Above this point, which is the most competitive global pricing, we cannot go above it. Because, Mr. President, let us be clear. Any pricing that goes into the electricity grid is a pass-through to who? Consumers. And consumers are not just me when I turn on my lights, because I don't live in darkness. I got to turn on my lights too, so I got to pay electricity bill too, right? So I don't want my electricity bill to be exorbitant because it affects me. It affects my family. It affects my community. It affects all of we. So the notion that we don't care about consumers is just a misnomer. But this part of my ministry, as the Ministry of Business, I also want to call into account, Mr. President, because a consumer also includes the business community. And when I meet with the business community, when I met with the business community, as we did, the business community tells me that there are two recurring costs that they have that drive costs up in their business. Two, the cost of labor, on the one hand, and I don't know if anybody in the history of mankind has ever agreed willingly to have lower salaries and wages. We're not looking to do that, clearly. So labor is a fixed cost, is a recurring cost. But what's the second recurring cost to business? Energy. The second highest recurring cost to businesses is energy. And I want to pause here for a moment to bring some numbers to your attention. On the Central Bank website, you will find this data readily available. We talk about the price of fuel, we talk about the cost of living and how things have gone up and how expensive things are. I want to share these numbers with you, Mr. President. I have before me, and it's available on the Central Bank website, but I'm happy to make it a document, the economic performance and outlook from the Central Bank that gives me data up to October 2023.
What's the date of the economic outlook?
October 2023.
Thank you.
Under intermediate goods, Mr. President, fuels, imports. In 2018, Mr. President, the fuel import bill for this country was $582.2 million. In 2019, $579 million. In 2020, COVID, $431.3 million. In 2021, also COVID, $525.7 million. Point of recovery commencing 2022, Mr. President. Remember, I started out in 2018 with $582.2 million. In 2022, when the price of oil per barrel soared, Barbados's import bill for fuel rose to $913.9 million. It is now December. This report, Mr. President, is October. And as of October of 2023, the fuel import bill was $828.6 million. The year didn't done yet. Those are the numbers, Mr. President, that have been driving increases in fuel costs and a consequential increase, Mr. President, on cost of living. So the imperative of getting renewables onto the system to mitigate against the vagaries of global oil prices and to move existing businesses away from fossil fuels, and I happen to also be the minister with responsibility for BNOC and MPC that imports fuels into the country. So I know what their imports look like. I know what their volumes look like, and I know what their challenges are. I'm not guessing. And so we now are in a position where we have to find that balance between fossil fuel imports, the impact on the import bill, the impact on cost of living, and how we're able to reduce the pricing. So, Mr. President, competitive pricing on storage is not something that we can take lightly. We have to ensure that we're able to get the best pricing because no one wants to add to what we already have, Mr. President, as high costs if we don't have the best prices for batteries. And so that is why we have prioritized these partnerships and these relationships with the global community that produces them and is going to underwrite our ability to get the best pricing available for Barbadian consumers, for Barbados as a country. And so the framework, Mr. President, that we are looking at now and that the legislation amendment is meant to facilitate is for the renewable energy sector as it stands now and as we can see it evolving over time to be in a position to move where systems, because what Cabinet has approved, Mr. President, is that for systems between 1 and under 10 megawatts, the Fair Trading Commission, which already has a pilot for up to 50 megawatts, will continue to have over the next 4 years the responsibility for oversight over that. But in order to move quickly and to get bulky storage into the country, for systems above 10 megawatts, Mr. President, we will go to competitive procurement. It allows us to make those decisions that have been foreseen by the IFC in July, by the FTC itself in its last decision on 1 to 10 megawatts, and also by the Rockefeller team to move to the next phase of development in this country, Mr. President. It is not as simple as we would like it to be. We accept that. It has not been as smooth as we would want it to be, by far, Mr. President. But what I can tell you is that countries around the world have watched how Barbados has moved, and they have been in awe at this small country making big strides and doing it well, Mr. President. Finding the best partners wherever they are. We ain't gone in the little corners and find people whose credentials are dubious, questionable. We've made sure that anybody with whom we align ourselves, we can stand up next to. And so Prime Minister, in the margins of COP, would have launched the partnership with Rockefeller, and we will work with them to be able to get this matter completed. The final thing that I want to say on the process of competitive procurement, Mr. President, because I know that there are concerns as well about the government and the absence of our ability to manage some of these things, Mr. President, because we have resource constraints. Everybody knows that. Also, under the partnership with Rockefeller and the IDB, we have agreed to the identification of a globally recognized firm based out of Argentina as the transaction advisor, who would be the manager of the entire process going forward for competitive procurement. Lisa isn't managing it. The minister isn't managing it. The technical officers in the ministry will have capacity built up to support them so that they can be in a position in time to come. But a globally recognized entity that has worked with 2 other countries in the region who have gone in this direction will be managing it on the government's behalf and building capacity in the ministry so we're able to move to the next stage. Yesterday, in our industry consultation, I had one of the independent power producers who came up to me and said, my only regret is y'all didn't do this sooner. My only regret is that you didn't do it for systems that are smaller than 10 megawatts, because my system is smaller than that. My only regret is that you didn't do it for even up to kilowatt size storage. I said, no, the FTC as an institution will continue to manage systems up to a certain size, and then we will go to the market for systems above that. That, Mr. President, under the competitive procurement framework, is what is approved by Cabinet, what is contemplated by the government, and the legislation is drafted in this way to allow for the effluxion of time, to allow for things that we can't see now to evolve later. As we have seen, and as I have outlined, 2019 had to change it in 2023, 2021 had to change it in 2023, and we're still making changes because time has been so kind to us in a way where we have stepped in front of the curve, but at the same time, technology has so far evolved that we have to make sure that we're able to keep up. Mr. President, in closing, I want to also just take the opportunity to share two things. As this sector evolves, we need to be able to build further capacity. We need to be able to ensure that in the way we have built the partnerships and the relationships with the Rockefellers of the world and the IKEA funds and all of those, that we are also able to then be, in turn, that exporter of skills because Barbados has built its capacity. Not just that country that draws our energy sources from renewable energy sources, but that country that leads, that other countries now come to be able to have the benefit of our skills and our experience and our expertise. We have to be that. And it is on that basis, Mr. President, that we have launched a program that we are in development with. We expect to be able to bring it to the market early in 2024, called the Future of Work. Who are the skills that we need? In the ministry, for example, the Ministry of Public Service has already approved the creation of an electricity unit in the ministry. We don't have that now. We don't have grid modeling capacity in the ministry to be able to see what is happening, what licenses are onboarded relative to what's on the grid. We don't see that. So in 2024, we will be moving to establish an electricity unit supporting the expansion of the capacity internal to the Fair Trading Commission and working with the utility to ensure that we have the skills we need to make sure that the things that we can see, Prime Minister always tells us, you can't be surprised by the things that you can see. Be surprised by the things that you can't. So we are making sure we put the government, the people of Barbados, in a position at the public sector level to have the skills and the exposure that they need to be able to give recommendations on the best guidance for Barbados as a country. And so, Mr. President, I want to take the opportunity as I close to assure the people of Barbados the Fair Trading Commission remains in law a quasi-judicial body. The government of Barbados does not and has not gotten involved in the decisions of the FTC to date. So many times people call me from the media and others to ask me, what is your view? Do you have a comment on the decision of the FTC on this? And I may be wearing black and white today, but I always say to them, Mr. President, I am neither called to the bar nor do I sit on the bench. So I am neither lawyer nor judge. So I don't get myself involved as the minister in the affairs of the FTC, except as is provided for in the legislation, Article 17 of the FTC Act, where you give directions of a general nature through the chairman, but specifically on administrative matters. So yes, when the FTC comes as part of our estimates development process and says, we need more staff, we need more skills, these are the skills we need, my answer is, okay, good, let's do that, because you need the capacity. When the FTC says that they're undertaking an organizational review and they're looking at transformation as to see what comes next, I'm going to say, yes, I'm looking forward to receiving it once your board approves it. That's what we will do. That is the nature of the creature that is the Fair Trading Commission. And long may it be so, Mr. President. And so I want to assure Barbadians that there is no sinister, I use my own words again, intention with this bill. I want to assure Barbadians that a considerable amount of work has been undertaken to get us to this stage, and that the Barbadians who meet me on the road and tell me, Minister, why can't I get my thing connected to the grid? What we can do? How I can get connected to the grid, Minister? What to do? What happened with Light and Power? When the technician on Light and Power came the other day, I saw a technician on the road outside of my neighborhood cutting back trees for the power lines. and I stopped to greet them. And he said, Minister, why everybody demonizing light and power? Well, we can't do this, and we can't put people more on for the grid. We all gonna do. Unlocking the grid, Mr. President, is not about the government of Barbados. It's about the Barbadians who want to get onto the grid and get their systems that they have invested in connected. It is about the Barbadians who have picked up their retirement savings or their gratuities, and they have invested in a renewable energy system that they want connected to the grid. It is about the Barbadians, Mr. President, who expected to get a check in the mail or credited onto their light bill so that they are in a position to not pay a light bill because they've invested in a system. It is about the Barbadians who want to buy the houses up in the HOPE program, who is the house which is de-risked by the panels on the roof. It is about allowing those Barbadians to be empowered, Mr. President. It is about lowering the cost of business in this country, to businesses, by reducing the cost to business, by allowing them to get sources of energy that are renewable, rather than bringing in the heavy fuel bill that I've already cited, Mr. President. That's what this is about. There's nothing sinister about it. And with these words, Mr. President, I beg to commend this bill to this honorable chamber and to the honorable members of the Senate. And I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Speakers, Senator Maladu.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, you know it is generally my style to be quite quick and get to the point. I will ask you today to bear with me on this particular matter. I need to take a little bit of time to perhaps at first agree with most everything that has been said regarding the state of the energy sector in Barbados. In fact, I think I can ignore the first 3 pages of my notes because they have been quite eloquently dealt with. However, there is a material point of departure that I would like to take with this amendment and disagreement with the honourable member, the Leader of Government Business. And if I have it noted correctly, I would like to quote the Senator, who says that this amendment is in essence the same as paragraph 4, or clause 4, that is already in the legislation, and is also the same as paragraph 3. I want to disagree completely with that. The essence of this legislation is completely different to paragraphs 1 and paragraphs 3. And I was not, Mr. President, a member of this chamber when clause 4 was passed, which was a material departure from what was there before. So, bear with me, Mr. President, as I say, I'm going to take a little time here today to get this right. To understand this bill, we need to first of all understand that within the Utility Regulation Act, there are 10 specific mentions of the Fair Trading Commission, according to my counting using my Word document. So if I'm wrong, I apologize. But there then are a further many inferences to how the Utility Regulation Act works in conjunction with Cap 326C, the Fair Trading Act. In the Fair Trading 326C, paragraph 37, originally gave 2 exemptions for very specific reasons, such that the minister could intervene and overrule, if you might, the Fair Trading Commission. In clause 1, it says, and if I might read it, it says, to be exempted from the application of all or any of the provisions of this Act where the service provider can establish that the market for the utility service supplied by the service provider is effectively competitive. My emphasis, sir, effectively competitive. Clause number 3, sir, clause number 2 it joins the two, but clause number 3 then gives the minister, who may, on the recommendation of the commission or on his own initiative, and I'll leave out a few words, but come to the last part, and it also says, where the minister is satisfied that the market for the utility service supplied by the service provider is effectively competitive. That is what clauses 1, 2, and 3 cover, Mr. President. And hence, I wish to disagree with what has been put forward, because clause 4, which was introduced in 2019, changed completely that approach, sir. And it instead introduced a different threshold. It introduced a threshold that says where the minister is satisfied that the exemption is required in the public interest, sir. Now, I find it difficult to understand exactly what is and is not the public interest at different times, because it's not defined anywhere. I do understand a competitive market, sir. Clause number 5, which is the one that we're debating today, goes on to use the same rationale again to talk about what's in the public interest. So that is the difference, is that what we need to understand is that in the original legislation, it was clear that the FTC had a role to be a proxy for a competitive market when no such competitive market existed. But as soon as you have a competitive environment, there's no need for the Fair Trading Commission. The market forces will determine. And that is what it is there for. Now, what we are hearing today, Mr. President, and as I said, let me go back and repeat everything that the Leader of Government Business, Senator Cummings, has said. I agree with, I understand the background of it, and we have found ourselves in a situation where we have had an excellent government policy. We have had excellent people implementing it. We have had businesses stepping forward and putting their capital in it. All of these investors, all of these things have happened, and we have accelerated at a pace. I understand, I think we are 13% renewables today or something, one of the highest countries in the world, if not the highest. All of those things are true. However, that is not a justification, Mr. President, for a clause that now gives the minister, substantive Minister of Energy, I would think is what this is referring to, such powers to do this, which didn't exist before. In fact, during the Senator's presentation, I didn't count, but perhaps I should go back and count, how many times the word competition was mentioned and the reference to a competitive procurement framework being the essence of what the Rockefeller Institute has said, is that if you have a competitive environment, if you have a competitive procurement framework, you need not a regulator. A regulator is there to be a proxy when no such competitive environment exists. And I want to agree with the Senator that today a competitive environment exists. And therefore, in my reading of the existing legislation, there is absolutely no need for this clause at all. None whatsoever. You know, Mr. President, I've often been told by my grandmother that empty drums make the most noise. And it seems that, not sure where it is coming from, Mr. President, but there seems to be maybe some noise coming from somewhere. So I don't know why it is necessary at all.
I'm not hearing any.
Lucky you, Mr. President. So let's not mistake what I am saying. I understand clearly the problem that we are presented with. I understand where we are faced. We have to do something to unlock the gridlock. All I am saying is that I believe that those powers exist today. My concern with this legislation, sir, is that, and let me be very open and honest with all of you. I trust in our Minister of Energy today. I trust in our Prime Minister today. I trust in our government today. I believe that what they're doing is the right thing. However, this clause does not only apply to them. This clause applies in perpetuity until it is removed. So, in any future, if we pass this today, any minister deciding that something is in the public interest may simply take it outside the FTC and make a decision. I don't think that is a good thing. Mr. President, I agree we have a problem. I agree we have to fix the problem. But my personal feeling is, in reading this, is that we already have the solution for fixing it. Because the legislation, as originally drafted with clauses 1, 2, and 3 only, allowed specifically for an exemption where the minister may, on the recommendation of the commission, I'm quoting clause 3 again, sir, or on his own initiative, exempt the utility service provided by any service provider or part of the utility service from the application of all or any of the provisions of this Act where the minister is satisfied that the market for the utility service supplied by the service provider is effectively competitive. That's what the laws of Barbados read today and have read so from the beginning of the passing of that Act. There is no need, in my opinion, to do this. In fact, I would ask a question. What is, in fact, the difference between the supply of electricity covered by a utility service? Wouldn't that be a renewable energy resource by a renewable energy producer? And is that not covered by any service provider? What is the need for this? So, as I said at the beginning, Mr. President, I was going to be slow and methodical in front of this. So, understand, I will say again, perhaps I understand this, as the leader of government business knows, a little bit better than the average consumer. I've been involved in the installation of photovoltaic. I've been involved in the installation of batteries. I've been involved in the investment in photovoltaic companies. I've felt the pain of the country. I think we have an excellent public utility. If anyone in here thinks they would like to be in some other country other than the one that we've had with Barbados Light and Power, let me know, because we have had an excellent public utility. Many, many years, they've done us a tremendous service. I am fortunate to travel a lot. I'm fortunate to have businesses outside of Barbados, and in many countries, the public utility is nowhere near as good as what we have in Barbados. What we have is a gridlock, as described, that needs to be released. And all I am saying, Mr. President, I repeat it again, is I believe the power is there today without doing anything more. However, I believe I'm going to finish on this part, but I may have to just check my notes. What I would suggest instead is, if we really need to have this clause, the minister, senator today, has explained to us very succinctly. Today we have 91 megawatts of a potential 450 in photovoltaic installed. Perhaps another 10 down at Trent's. We only have 5 of battery storage. We need to get to 206 quickly. We've heard that the Rockefeller Institute and all these other names, which I heard today for the first time being involved, excellent, great, getting this type of expertise. I understand that they believe that the solution is a competitive framework. I agree with them. So why not let's build into this clause here, rather than it be so permanent that any future minister or government could use this clause and declare public interest, which I genuinely, Mr. President, don't always know, and I don't know where it is defined. Why not let us build in one simple thing in here? I'll agree to this. Up to 200 megawatts. Get these first 200 megawatts going, and at that point in time, for sure, you have a competitive environment, and there's absolutely no need for this, because the underlying legislation already says that in a competitive environment, you do not need a regulator who is a proxy for a competitive environment. Personally, Mr. President, I think we today have a competitive environment. We have all that we need to do. The minister has all the power that needs today to do exactly this. We do not need to pass this amendment. We do not need it. I am concerned, though, that to pass it is to grant some powers that don't exist today that could be used in a rogue way. That's what troubles me. So a sunset clause within this would make it palatable to be. That sunset clause might be when we reach 100 megawatts. It might be when we reach 200 megawatts. But it would be a specific period of time to solve a current problem, and it does not continue on and to be used in some nefarious way at some later time. Mr. President, I believe I have covered all that I wanted to cover in my various notes. I, again, will finish by congratulating the government on an excellent policy looking long-term. I believe that we need to release the private sector, release the public utility, break this gridlock that exists. But I do not think that this amendment is necessary to do so. With those words, I'm grateful to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Mallory. Senator Crystal Joyce.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have to say that I, like Senator Mallory, came this morning with a number of questions. And in trying to do some due diligence, I made sure to get my ducks in a row before coming this morning. And I was happy that the leader of government business went through very clearly where we are at in the renewable energy sector in relation to the technical specifications, because I think that is important, Mr. President. When we first, and this was probably about 7, 8 years ago, when renewable energy began to be a hot topic, more or less, in a very real way. It was driven by environmental advocates. It was a need for us to recognize that there was an issue with fossil fuels and the emission of greenhouse gases, and there needs to be a replacement very quickly to renewable energy sources. Politicians and the political class globally picked up on this. And what happened was policy started to be crafted. And then somewhere along the lines, as the advocates were out front, the politicians were selling it to their citizens, we then realized, oops, there are technical engineering requirements that need to be done that are not necessarily aligned with the renewable energy to push, Mr. President. So that is why, even very early on, in some of the documentation, you will see from previous reports, there was an acknowledgement that we can only onboard so much capacity to the grid, and then from there you will need some type of energy storage. I believe up to 10%, given the existing grid infrastructure. If the grid was updated and the infrastructure upgraded, the maximum would have been 20% in terms of the amount of the share of renewable energy on the grid. So, Mr. President, when we fast forward now to 2023, where there has been significant economic interest in the sector, and people have made large sums of investment, you find the engineering is lagging behind the market, as well as the regulation, as was rightly said, Mr. President. And like Senator Malu, sir, I want you to give me a little leeway, because as the leader of government business spoke, I was frantically writing notes, trying to understand this new arrangement, where we're going, because this is all new information. If you're not on the inside in the discussions, persons on the outside, this is all very new information. And the first thing I want to ask, and I'll be asking a lot of questions, and maybe there are no answers to these questions. When we move in this direction, because we want to reduce, one, our dependence on fossil fuels, as the leader of government business noted just now, upwards sometimes of $900 million in fuel imports are needed to satisfy the demand for the Barbadian economy and society. I put the two together for that reason. However, as much as we've moved in the direction to increase the amount of renewable energy being, one, installed, and two, being brought on board, what is not being articulated is what is the bottom dollar benefit to consumers. A lot of the times when we talk about renewable energy, or what I've been noticing, and as I said, sir, probably like 8 years ago, I was more involved in the technical aspects of the renewable energy sector in Barbados and some other islands across the Caribbean. But what is being lost, I think, in the conversation is we have to onboard, yes, the 200 megawatts, but what then is the savings that is going to be passed down then to the consumer in real dollar terms? Because on the outside, consumers are listening, you know, people have made all of this investment, they need to get back their money. So we have to move quickly. How then in a small market, even now, with the utility still being the one responsible and accountable for the grid infrastructure, how are these things being managed to ensure that, because the market is small, it doesn't necessarily mean a reduction in price? Because we know with small markets, if there are few players, as much as they're independent power producers, the utility is still very much in charge of the grid. And unless we're now moving to a new phase of distribution, microgrids, as I'm hearing, Mr. President, how are we negotiating all of these things? Because the main concern that I have is, a lot of the times we hear we must move to renewable energy, we must move to clean energy. But when you look back, sir, at SDG 7, it says ensuring affordable, Mr. President, and clean energy for all. So I don't know if it's probably going to be a technical study that needs to be done. I don't know, Mr. President. But I think what needs to be clear to Barbadians is, how do I benefit from the government and I'll use this word, relinquishing power, because the minister noted that an Argentinian firm will be the ones managing this process. You have a number of international players coming in, along with local stakeholders. But how am I going to benefit at the end of the day, Mr. President? Mr. President, I have a few more questions as I go through the notes that I wrote. As we move to acquire renewable energy storage through this new, let's call it a consortium. If it's not a consortium, then I would like then for someone to explain to me then the arrangement between the philanthropic partners and the government and the local partners. I need an explanation then if it's not, and for lack of a better term, a consortium. Well, so then it is a technical assistance then. Okay. When that battery storage is acquired, Mr. President, who owns it? Who owns it? Is it upfront, we own it? Is it through a tenure where, you know, a certain amount of testing needs to be done? Once we realize that it is operational, then the ownership is transferred to the government, because if upfront we own it, something goes wrong, who then takes the liability for that type of scenario? I'm just walking through scenarios, Mr. President, because I'm really trying to map out where this arrangement is going. And as the minister, the leader of government business rightly said, what are some of the potential things we have to think about in the future? And I hope that that is how my contribution is being taken at the moment. Sir, in addition to that, once that storage comes on stream, who then regulates it? The actual operations and regulations in relation to the storage. Is it the FTC? Is it the Rockefeller firm? I mean, I'm trying to really understand, sir, how this entire framework is going to be mapped out. Mr. President, and if, like Senator Malou, who spoke before me, if the government has identified a specific problem, which is unlocking the grid, that is the problem we're trying to solve with the amendment today. Why the carte blanche approach then to the legislation if there's a specific problem you're trying to solve with the amendment? Why not bring an amendment that allows for a clear understanding of what you are trying to do, given the problems that you have, just like the amendment we had in 2020 with the renewable energy producers? We defined them, Mr. President, we defined the grid, we defined, and then we outlined very clearly what the role of the FTC was in relation to the renewable energy producers. I, like Senator Malou, have my reservations about how broad this piece of legislation is. And if we are also saying that we don't know what will happen in the future, Mr. President, it then means we're bringing the legislation, one, where there's uncertainty. Two, Mr. President, we are now giving power to the minister in an environment that is already what I would call, from the outside, appears to be chaotic. Appears to be chaotic. And I understand why persons on the outside will have their reservations about why this bill should not be passed. Because, as I said earlier, Mr. President, there has been no real articulation of how consumers are benefiting. Now we're hearing there are international players who want to work with the government, and then the question would be, how do they benefit from working with us? Nothing in this life is for free, Mr. President. Nothing in this life is for free, Mr. President. We know this. We know this. We know this, Mr. President. And I'm just asking questions. If you can't ask questions, then, Mr. President, where are we? Right, Mr. President? But, sir, in all seriousness, similar to what happened with the renewable energy policy and what happened in terms of the lack of engineering solutions to follow suit, I have my reservations about putting in place a piece of legislation that allows the minister the type of power that we are granting, still with a level of uncertainty about the engineering specifications for the sector. And let me also say this, Mr. President. No one has said what the design of the energy sector is in 2030. Telling me about your energy mix and how much renewable energy you want to have on the grid is one thing, but what is the design of the energy sector? Or is it continued that the utility has the largest share? Are you going to give more access to independent power producers? How is the market being rationalized with all the competing interests? Is it going to continue to be monopolistic then? Are you going to have certain persons who, again, have microgrids? Are those microgrids going to be independent in and of the utility? Is the utility then going to need some part of the investment going in from those persons who have the microgrids in order to maintain the grid? There are a lot of moving parts, Mr. President. There are a lot of moving parts and competing interests. So I think one of the things we have to figure out, and I don't know if it's part of the work that's being done now, is asking ourselves what is the design of our energy sector in a 2030 and a 2035. Because we might be running ahead, because we might be the new flavor of the month because of the world stage and the world recognition that the Prime Minister has given Barbados. But there has to be a technical understanding, I think, of where we are, where we want to go, and understanding what that design looks like, Mr. President. Sir, in closing, I also want to make, because I've completely gone off script. In closing, I want to make this request. A lot of the times when we have discussions in the public, or there may be persons who disagree with the government, it is because legislation or information comes in a vacuum. The Ministry of Energy has done a phenomenal job of placing the legislation where we're at in terms of real-time data for what's happening in the renewable energy sector. They have statistics, you name it, it is on their website. Sir, my request is, given that this thrust for renewable energy is clearly a hallmark of where Barbados wants to go, we treat it just like we treat the economy. Have regular, either quarterly, semi-annually, annually updates to the public about what is happening in the sector and what is the status of the sector. Because, Mr. President, when the leader of government business, if she chose not to divulge a lot of that information this morning, how many people in Barbados would know that the situation is as critical as it is? The average Barbadian, how would they know? So when you come now with a piece of legislation that is like the one before us, it just seems as though what the minister want to do, what she want to do, or what he want to do. Might like Bill High, the one rob we, backdoor deals happening. So my request, Mr. President, is that there be regular updates in the public domain about the renewable energy sector. Because if we are moving in a direction that clearly warrants the type of technical expertise quickly, if we are in that type of situation, then we have to treat it then as such in terms of public information and dissemination of that information, Mr. President. Sir, I'm still in between minds about how I feel about the legislation. Despite knowing all of the having an understanding of the technical challenges the sector is facing. But what I will say is, if competitive procurement is the way forward for storage, or rather a question, who has oversight over that? Who has the oversight over that? And further, is it applicable to such a small market like Barbados? Given that we know that when you have producers in one small market or providers in one small market, they collude on the price. So the head thing you're trying to avoid, the market colludes and prices increase, or everybody has a standard price. Ask anybody that owns a cell phone. They will tell you, there's no competition there, Mr. President. The market is too small. You go over at the red, they can give you one price, and the blue have the same price. I'm here coconut vendors even, Mr. President. You know how many coconut vendors in Barbados. So I'm just trying to really emphasize, Mr. President, there needs to be a real mapping out of this, because I would hate for us to be in a situation where economic interests trump the social objectives that we're trying to achieve, which in my mind I thought was cheaper energy and access, as well as the environmental objectives. And I think, unfortunately, the renewable energy sector globally has been captured by profit-seeking interests, and that is unfortunate, Mr. President, because sustainability is not just about the environmental aspect, there's social aspects to it, as well as financial. And I don't know if the government's policy moving forward, as much as there was the right for homeowners to have access to the grid, how ingrained the social aspect in terms of affordability, it has to be up front and center. Because if the case, and Mr. President, I will say this, what would be the sense of having renewable energy capacity in Barbados, but the light bills increase? If the consumer does not benefit at the end of the day? That has to be at the center of all of this, because As much as we talk about clean energy and we're moving to renewables, Mr. President, our contribution is minuscule. So then what are our priorities? Is it greenhouse gas emissions at any cost? The reduction of greenhouse gas emissions at any cost that get passed on to the consumer? Or is it making sure that consumers in Barbados get the most affordable deal when it comes to electricity and energy? Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Driggs. Speakers, Senator Nichols.
Mr. President, I am obliged for you acknowledging me as I rise to make my contribution to this debate. And sir, I listened very carefully to the last two speakers, and the concerns that they raised I find entirely legitimate, and I would try my best to answer some of the concerns that they have raised, these important issues within the public domain. Sir, in my preparation for this debate, I had the opportunity, sir, to revisit the Fair Trading Commission decision on energy storage framework and tariffs, a decision that came out on the 28th of June, 2023. And the FTC in that decision made reference to the revisit of the legislation and the powers that are appertaining to the minister and the commission in very much the same way that we are amending this legislation or purporting to amend the legislation today. And I will come to that in a little bit more detail. But I want to say from the outset, sir, that one of the challenges that we have, particularly in dealing with the field of renewable energy, is that there are not a lot of local expertise and knowledge on the island. And in my preparations for this debate, I sought to consult with the known players in the market, some of whom are lawyers and some of whom are not, who have way more knowledge in this regard. And all of them have indicated to me that perhaps if we had gone through more consultation, we would not have to be responding to some of the public comments that have been thrown in the way of the government in relation to this bill. But indeed, there is nothing to fear within the bill at all. I'd like to go on record to thank Senator Malilu for opening up for me the possibilities what this amendment pretends, because I remember as a young senator coming in here, we in the parliamentary party, were paired with senior members of the party, and I was at the time attached to the late Sir Harold St. John, but he was not well, so Sir Henry Ford took over the process of being my mentor. And Sir Henry taught me something in one of my conversations early with him in terms of preparing for debates in the chamber, that the government doesn't always have to go on top of the mountain and shout out what it is doing, particularly in Barbados, to achieve a lot. Sometimes you just have to get on with the work without a lot of fanfare and flourish. And certainly he listed a number of things that if the government had said this is what we intend to do, it perhaps never would have occurred. And one of the things that was one of the most remarkable things to transform, and sir, I'm not digressing because I will come back to it, is the Tenantries Freehold Purchase Act, and the government did not go around saying we can take up plantation land and right the wrongs of 300 years. If you had done that, like Mugabe, it would never have occurred, and we would not have been able to lift thousands and thousands of people out of a state of contingency living where they can be removed at the instance of a landlord. Sir, this reminds me of what we are doing here. And this is an amendment, this bill before the chamber is to amend Section 37 of the Utilities Regulations Act. And Senator Malou is right. There is provision for exemptions from the regulatory process under the FTC in the Act. And that the one that is being done under this amendment is similar to the one that was done in 2019, which was not in the original Act when it was passed 23 years ago, in 2000. That is correct. But I want to say to Senator Malou that the mechanism in Section 37 is not the only basis for exemption from the regulatory process. And what the government is doing is adding another mechanism. So that to suggest that it is not the same as the original doesn't mean that it's nefarious or that it's wrong. And I'm not saying that Senator Malou suggested that, but some people hearing him might think that this is going outside the scope of the original legislation, but it is. That is the intention. And I cannot think of a better mechanism to determine the exemption from the regulatory process than something that is guided by the public interest. And I thank him for opening up. And I would go back now to why I recall the advice from Sir Henry, because it seems to me that without any fanfare, and I think the minister may quietly chastise me for saying this, but without any fanfare, it seems to me that this is the type of measure legislatively that can force the current service provider or the large dominant service provider driven by the shareholder that has no interest or concern for the Barbadian public other than paying more increased rates. I will deal with that, but it seems to me that that this is a measure that can afford greater protection for the public interest by the minister taking the necessary action. But I want to go through Section 37 because it seems that all you have to do is say you're giving the minister power and therefore that this is a kind of boogeyman that you need to frighten people with, right? Section 37 provides that, first of all, a service provider may apply to the FTC to be exempted from an application. So service provider can make an application to the FTC. And the FTC should consider whether the utility service supplied by the service provider should be exempted and makes recommendations to the minister in relation to that exemption. That is the first provision in Section 37. It involves the minister within the process of the granting an exemption to the supply of a utility service. So that the notion that the government is now trying to do something that creates this all-powerful minister is wrong. It was there from the inception. And the service provider under Section 37, subsection 1, can make that application on their own accord. And the commission makes the recommendation to the minister. This was always in the original legislation. What Senator Malou drew our attention to, Mr. President, is that the consideration is where the service provider is effectively, the utility service supplied by the service provider is effectively competitive. That was the original consideration that led to an exemption from the utility regulatory framework under this legislation. In 2019, Mr. President, Parliament included a different category where the minister, on the recommendation of the commission, again, on the recommendation of the commission, or on his own initiative, exempt the utility service supplied by a service provider or part of that utility service from an application of all or any of the provisions of the Act where the minister is satisfied that the exemption is required in the public interest. This was done in 2019, passed in Parliament. So that while Senator Maliu, Mr. President, is correct to say that it is a different criteria from that originally settled in the legislation, that is not to suggest that because government did it in 2019 and now doing it again in relation to the supply of electricity from a renewable energy resource, that the government is doing something wrong. All that is happening here is that given the knowledge and experiences that we have gathered in relation to the renewable energy sector in Barbados.
Mr. President,
And what do you raise, Senator?
on a point of order, sir. At no point during my presentation did I at any point suggest, infer, imply that the government was doing anything of the sort. And to use those words in relation to my speech is not in good order, sir.
Actually, yes, you are correct. You did raise concerns of the potential of future governments, but you were quite clear that the government was not doing anything wrong. Senator Nichols, you will withdraw and move forward.
I'm guided by you, Mr. President, but I certainly did not even intend to say that he was saying that because I carefully took note of what he was saying. And I have my own response to how we can deal with the situation of the abuses by future governments. So that was not the intent. So I apologize unreservedly if you took that as the comment I was making. When I said anything wrong, I'm not talking about misusing the powers in the Act. I'm talking about anything wrong in terms of bringing the amendment. That is what I meant, Mr. President. So I was not attributing any comment directly to Senator Maliu in that regard. I'm talking about government being wrong in bringing the amendment and the suggestion that this amendment is not needed. Therefore, that is where the wrong that I alluded to. So perhaps I needed to be a little more clearer in my indication. But sir, the point that I am making, sir, is that one must not go away with the view that government is now suddenly coming, as I heard one commentator say, at Christmas, when everybody is busy, to slip in this thing to create this all-powerful minister. From the inception, Section 37 of the substantive legislation included a provision for a service provider to apply to the commission for an exemption and the commission to make recommendation to the minister who would determine whether to grant or refuse that application. From the inception, sir. So I want to just suggest to all of those, perhaps I will not refer to anybody else, because I don't have any particular reason to be vexed with anybody in here, or at all. But to suggest, Mr. President, that because the public interest criteria is being added to this legislation is something now sinister, and that is something now wrong, is again to mischaracterize or to misconstrue the ambit of the original provision within its legislative context. And that is the point that I'm trying to make. Now, the government does not need, as has been suggested, to set out the subsections of the legislation to determine public interest. Public interest is public interest. And it is a legislative and legal term that is used in a broad and a liberal way. We can determine what the public interest will be in all times, at all times, and in all places. And certainly, it is a drafting term or legal term that is used by draftsmen in legislation to give the ability of the legislation to cover any number of circumstances. So in this Fair Trading Commission decision issued this year, Mr. President, the Fair Trading Commission signaled that government might have to revisit this legislation and make the provision which we are here today doing. The FTC, sir. But you know what happens in our country or in our societies where we have too few people who spend the time to do the necessary research or to bring themselves up to speed or to engage persons who know. They're like when the media drop a mic in front of them. Scratch the surface and move on, throw a political barb. And all of a sudden we hear that the government is now trying to mash up the FTC and create an all-powerful minister. And in an era where social media headlines, because you will go on social media and see Senator Nichols said something in the Senate, but not the context. And then all the comment section come down without reading the Fair Trading Commission decision on energy storage tariffs, energy storage framework and tariffs, June 28, 2023. The genesis of the amendment before this year. Because the Fair Trading Commission does not have the capacity. When we read this decision, the Fair Trading Commission is talking about pilot studies for four years. And so I spoke to a leading player, an attorney at law within the Barbados Renewable Energy Association set up. They're talking about unlocking about $750 million in investment in renewable energy applications that are waiting to come into the Barbadian economy that we can't process. And if you read this, the FTC is crying out for help. So that as a government, are we to know to sit down and say, well, look, almost $1 billion in investment in the sector locked up without the regulatory capacity to determine these applications. And I don't want to be heard to be criticizing the FTC, but it is certainly apparent to most Barbadians that a rate increase has taken more than 2 years to determine in this country. And I'm not saying that the FTC is wrong or that there were not other reasons or factors outside of their control. It may have been the interveners, it may have been the utility service provider that involved in the back and forth. I don't know. I wasn't involved in it. But it took 2 years to deal with the question of a rate increase. A decision was given, an interim decision earlier this year, and a final decision was given, but still, up to now, Barbadians don't know what the actual rates will pay as a result of the conclusion of the process. That is the reality that we're dealing with. And that's so that the government's responsibility to this process, by way of the lead taken by the Honorable Minister, Leader of Government Business, as Minister of Energy, is to ensure that the public's interests are carried forward. And that the public interest element in this legislation that we are amending today allows for the process of exemptions in a necessary area. And it is not that the amendment, Mr. President, is that the minister has carte blanche, but the minister may, on recommendation of the commission, as it did in its decision in June 28th, 2023, or on their own initiative. Now, Mr. President, I want to say that I understand the comment or the concern, I should say, that you may have a rogue minister or government in the future. We still, for all extent and purposes, live in a society governed by the rule of law. This year and last year, the court struck down decisions by government, legislation that has been on the statute books for many years, this year and last year. New legislation that was passed by this administration, legislation that was passed by Tom Adams' administration, all struck down by the courts. Our courts are working. And I want to remind Barbadians that we have only ever had one incident of a government targeting the courts. When in 2018, a former prime minister who is now being consigned to the political historical dustbin said that we had the CCJ as judges dressing up in robes but they're really politicians. And that it was his intention, if re-elected, to pull Barbados out of the ambit of the CCJ. We have only had one instance where an active leader of a government lashed out at the courts in Barbados in such a direct way. Only once. There is no unfettered or untrammeled power in law, especially in a society governed by a written constitution, where the constitution is supreme and its principles are implied in how government operates. The rule of law still undergirds all that we do. A minister cannot act arbitrarily. A minister cannot act on irrelevant considerations or refuse to take relevant considerations into account. A minister cannot exercise any powers under law in a manner without consulting persons that ought to be consulted, even if the legislation does not delineate the persons to whom consultation must ensue. The minister cannot act in breach of the rules of natural justice or in breach of the principles that would undergird a legitimate expectation based on a past promise or past practice, where the legitimate expectation is engendered by that practice or promise. So that no power given to anyone, be it the minister or the FTC for that matter, is unreviewable by the courts. And I'm not saying so just because I practice in those courts, but sometimes we have to be reminded that when Parliament devolves power unto certain persons, whether it be the minister or institutions, that they don't have the ability to act as they like, as we say in Barbados. So that this notion that we're creating this all-powerful minister, where these powers are not attenuated by any reasonable measure, is akin, in my view, to the story we learn as children when Chicken Little get hit by the acorn and run around and tell everybody that the sky is falling on our heads. And that hysteria is done to generate a headline and a byline about what government is doing for purposes of mischief, and mischief only, without taking time to consider the rationale behind the amendment. Now, today, the Barbados Renewable Energy Association said very clearly they're in favor of this. Who in the sector has come out and said government is acting capriciously? Who? We know who are saying that they're against it. But we must go beyond scratching the surface in order to grab a headline, in order to be heard, or to be seen speaking, or to be appearing to sound intelligent. And understand what is at stake. Are we to not allow the consideration of the public interest to determine whether or not, on the recommendation of the commission or the minister acting in the public interest, to make a decision to exempt a supply of electricity from a renewable energy source? The technology is unfolding. Last year, or 2 years ago, I would dare say, Mr. President, in 2019, when the last set of amendments were made to this act, the technology was not there at a commercial scale to deal with battery storage. It was not. Let us be real, this technology is fast moving and evolving and improving. And it has its attendant dangers and it has its attendant challenges. the technology that is. But what are we to do? For 10 years, this country didn't even have a Ministry of Energy. For 10 years, there was no direct policy with attention to the whole concept of the energy needs of this country. And I stand here, sir, today, proud of my former schoolmate and colleague who gave clarity as to the purpose of this legislation. So, sir, I don't fear the amendment. The powers given to the minister, as I said, have been there from the inception. The public interest element was added for the first time in 2019 to deal with the exemption of a utility service provided. Today, we are seeking to allow for that exemption to come either through the recommendation of the commission or the minister on her own initiative in relation to the supply of electricity from a renewable energy resource by a renewable energy provider. That is all. That is all. That is all. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Nichols. Speakers, Senator King.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to pick up from where Senator Nichols left off. One of the first things that I would have encountered in the very first cabinet meeting, it went something like this: what are you seeking to do? Why are you seeking to do it? And how are you seeking to achieve it? That stuck with me from day one. Why, what, why, and how. This is a case of us being challenged to answer those three questions where this is concerned. And I perfectly understand why some of the doubt, some of the fear within the public sphere comes about. And I think we mentioned it earlier, but I would want to reiterate that sometimes in our attempt to get things done, which are to the benefit of the country as a whole, the communication between those charged or responsible with getting it done and those within the public domain, sometimes the communication is not as effective as it can be. And I believe that this is one of those occasions where persons seeking mileage at this particular point in time for their own careers or their own benefits use this occasion to put fear in the public domain. Mr. President, there are three things about fear that I would like to share here. I've shared one on a previous time, but there are three things I want to share here. Fear, F-E-A-R. Think about it. You got false evidence appearing real. And sometimes you can forget everything and run. Or you can face everything and rise. You have to choose which of those three you're going to do. This is the occasion for me, for us, to face everything and rise. There are challenges within the sector. There will be challenges anyhow, because we have to be realistic. We are not in the forefront of any technologies anywhere in the world. We have to wait and then get involved at the back end. It's not what we do as small island developing states. We just don't have the capacities yet. So therefore, when we start to compare what happens in Barbados as with other territories, one of the things that I know for sure is that other countries do not tell you about their failures and all the problems that they had in getting to where they get to. They're broadcast when they've got it all sorted out to you. And you may believe that, wow, they are doing this, and then you want to compare yourself to them and say, but if they're doing it, why can't we do it? Well, the reason is because you don't have the knowledge of all of the teething problems that they would have had to get them to where they are. So how can we expect then a country like ours, who is not in the forefront of developing the technologies, who is not in the forefront of creating the policies and all the other things, to not have problems? You're going to face problems. But what are you going to do? Are you going to spend a lot of time creating more and more unnecessary fear within the society, or are we going to face these things and deal with them? Now, for any reasonable person, if you tell me that you have a fuel cost of over $900 million, not 9 cents, not $90, $900 million, staring you in the face in 2023. And we are hoping to be carbon neutral by 2030. The question was asked, how is the general public going to benefit from this? Well, climate change in itself brings its challenges. But common sense would tell me that if you are saying that outside is getting hotter, and I am now in the business of creating energy from the sun, from that heat that I'm getting, and I can encourage other Barbadians to get into storage, because we have a storage problem. And one of the things that has been touted all the time is the ability for people to invest in this particular sector. And so if we can encourage our people to do something which they find very difficult to do, that comes from another conversation that should be had in another place, but I just make the point here, which is to be able to pool their resources together, to get involved in these types of initiatives, because all I keep hearing from every sector is also outside investors. What happened to Barbadian people who have the opportunity to invest in these things also? And if you have a storage problem, that is an area that I believe that persons who have the, I should say, guts first thing to get involved and do things, they want to look at. And you ask how it will benefit, well then from an economic standpoint, then persons who are doing storage, obviously there's a charge for it if it's going to be going into the grid. And then if we are trying to become carbon neutral, as I said earlier, it means then that smaller systems that go onto houses, more and more people begin to use them, then you're not under the gun based on what happens in oil-producing countries. You begin to take yourself away from the need for fossil fuels in that way. Obviously, then people will benefit from that. But the conversation so far today has always been on somebody else still providing the energy. But I want to suggest to the chamber that there's opportunity for individuals to get systems themselves and come off the grids. Now, I have visited a couple of places already where I've seen people doing it. A couple. And yes, there's costs. But in the initial stages of everything, there's always been costs. Sometimes we forget that this country, as small as it is, led the way, and I believe it probably would have been from the 70s, in terms of solar energy for water heaters. You know, and I always remember when I travel, And people be talking about, oh, my electric bill is high because, I have to do the water heater and this thing and that thing. And I'd be laughing. Because I have no such problem. So if you can see it from that small standpoint, in terms of a solar water heater and how it would have reduced your cost in terms of energy when you were using electrical ones, then you can think about this in a macro way, that if we get this right, if we can get these things done quickly, we can achieve what it is we set out from the beginning to, by 2030, to become carbon neutral and get these things done. We will be at least a step closer to being able to get these things done. Mr. President, I will not belabor the points because I believe the Honorable Senator Cummings, in her presentation, would have given us, just like the others, a lot of information that makes it a lot easier to understand why we are doing it and what we're seeking to do. And so I give my full support to this. And the other thing that I have to say this before I close. We have, for some unknown reason, should I say, well, it's not unknown to me, but sometimes I feel it's unknown to a lot of people. We watch a lot of movies. And if you watch any amount of Hollywood movies, they always, 99.99% of the time, present politicians as being either corrupt, inept, all these things. And if you watch these things all the time, you actually digest it and believe that this is how all politicians are, based on something that you are constantly fed all the time. Boom, 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 boom. It will put you in a position where no matter who forms a government in Barbados, no matter that you personally, in a small island like this, will probably know every single one of them in some form, shape, or fashion. You went to school with them, so you work with them in other jobs, you live near to them, you might be involved with somebody, cousin or something. There's some sort of a connection. But as soon as they become politicians, they become alien. Then everybody knows what they're capable of doing that is extremely bad. Nobody remembers that this is a person that you grew up with, or you knew, or you have seen, or you interacted with for years. But all of a sudden, they take on the devil out of hell. No, this, Mr. President, this is a madness. Because I got that serious. This is a madness. Now, why would the Honorable, and I'm going to, excuse me for, you don't get the title yet as such, man, but I'm calling you Honorable Lisa Cummings, as the minister, put herself in a position where the general public, as has been done to other persons on numerous occasions, put herself in a position where the general public can come up with all kinds of negative things that she's doing without any concern for how it affects her family, her children, nobody. This kind of madness, if it is for political gain, if it is for whatever, at some point in time, someone has to have enough guts to challenge it. Because I'm a firm believer, if a person is wrong, you have the right to say they are wrong. And if they're wrong, they face the consequences of being wrong. But for us to believe that a minister, regardless of who the minister is, and Senator Nichols made the point, can just get up in the morning and decide that he or she is going to do X, Y, Z, and not have to bear in mind that he or she represents a government, etc., a country, is, as my father would say, kind of jot too far. It cannot work. It doesn't work so in the real world. And even if we brought it down to the nitty-gritty, with the real things this be, do you think a person's colleagues can sit down and allow a one man or a one woman to cause them angst or shame or to lose a government? Let's get real. It's not going to happen. You ain't going to let it happen in your house with your children. You ain't going to let it happen. You ain't going to let it happen. First thing parents tell you, find time you leave door. You step out through there, don't know, and make me shame. Do you think that a politician can make these kind of decisions on their own? And they answer to who? Impossible. Impossible. Want me to say it again? Impossible. It cannot work. It cannot work. So all of the fear-mongering in the public domain needs a dose of reality, and a serious dose of reality. Because every time you have these things, we're living in Barbados yesteryear, where we talk foolishness and it stops in a small corner. See this? This takes you to the rest of the world. And this is not something to be trifled with, and it's not a joke. And the more you have people spouting things without seriously thinking about what the effects are, not only on this issue, but a whole lot of other things, you have to ask yourself, what are we doing? All of us here on this matter, Mr. President, is that I am 100% clear in my mind that the measures and the amendment that is being asked to be done will benefit the sector, and I can see clearly how the speed of doing business and getting things done will move us from what sometimes can be seen as a snail pace within which things in this region operate at, to move us to a place where we can all benefit from what I always call the God-given things that we have: the sun, the wind, the sea, all these other things. And it is not just in terms of, how should I say, the energy alone, but this translates to a lot of the other things, sometimes tangible and intangible things that are benefits that people will have. And so, Mr. President, I am obliged to you for allowing me this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of this sitting of the Honorable Senate for 1 hour for lunch, to return at 5 minutes before 3 p.m.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 2:55 p.m. today. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. The sitting is therefore suspended until 2:55 p.m. today. Senator Kevin Boyce, that is.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do apologize for my absence earlier, as I was in the other place where we have not settled the priority as to how we exist in both. Good afternoon, colleagues. I rise on behalf of the independent side of the proverbial table, and I must state from the onset that this is a topic which I do have some conflict in, as my firm represents a major electric supplier. However, I have been guided in the past that when making contributions of this nature, that I declare that conflict and try as much as possible to stay out of certain affrays. Now, sir, what we start with is, as usual, with my presentation, and I will say, however, that while I have declared that conflict, you will note, and I'm giving everyone early warning, that this speech may end on a somewhat selfish note. So I'm giving everyone ample opportunity to be able to rise as necessary. Sir, the proposed bill which speaks to the Utilities Regulation Act 282, and I was able to listen in part to the many and sensible contributions made all around this morning. And the proposed wording as set out has garnered some concern, where persons speak to the concern about the minister, the proposed insertion, the minister may, on the recommendation of the commission. Now, the recommendation of the commission part doesn't seem to have garnered much attention on social media. Everyone is focusing on the minister, what the minister may do. On his own initiative, exempt the supply of electricity from a renewable energy resource by a renewable energy producer from the application of all or any of the provisions of this act, where the minister is satisfied in all the circumstances that the exemption is required in the public interest. I listened to my colleague, Senator Nichols, as he set out the checks and balances that the courts provide. I listened to my colleague, Senator King, as he set out the checks and balances that good old Bajan raising provides. But we have to be cognizant that, yes, the wording is wide, but we have heard from the leader of the government business as to why the wording is the way it is and the intention of the government. But let's come back to that shortly. Now, the Utility Regulation Act, Mr. President, you may likely recall that we dealt with this in 2020 when dealing with the amendment which was done on the 7th, it commenced on the 17th of July 2020. And by that amendment, the government exercises right with regard to its energy policy to bring renewable energy producers and renewable energy resources under the governance of the Utilities Regulation Act. Similarly, in 2020, the government exercised its power and extended the function of the FTC by way of the Fair Trading Commission Act 2020 to include renewable energy producers. Now, what this bill does is in 2023 is to give the power of the minister, who we know has to act within the ambit of government policy, the ability to make certain exemptions to the application of the Utility Regulations Act to certain renewable energy producers. At the end of the day, sir, there is little, if any, restriction on government and its policy. The government has set out why it is doing what it's doing, and guess what? Active citizenry means that persons can make comments and can agitate and can say whether they like or dislike what the government proposes. Within the pillars of Parliament, government is entitled to set out its legislative reasoning for why it's done what it is proposing or what it is going to do, with, of course, certain restrictions. At the end of the day, only in few matters such as constitutional issues, or dare I say public sentiment, does the government find itself in a situation where it is limited as to how it can maneuver. And what is the government policy? Sir, I recall in the last time we debated this, and I had given a similar qualification and conflict warning, and I was almost gently chastised by Senator Harewood with regard to the government policy and the Barbados National Energy Plan for 2030, and the fact is better that we try to do it, and if we fail, well, at least we try, but let's push forward with our goals. I recall that conversation well. The blows were not too heavy. On previous debates, issues were raised, of course, with the cost of getting to a carbon neutral state. You will recall, sir, Senator Malalu used the opportunity to speak about the infrastructure and the cost of having the electronic vehicles and the necessary charging at port station and the actual proof of the proverbial pudding with regard to the cost implementation. Now, of course, no doubt buoyed by the COP28 objective, which is to triple the renewable energy generation of the world to 11,000 gigawatts by 2030, the government is saying that this legislation is necessary for them to achieve that goal. That's what this is. Now, while the government certainly is entitled to do so, we have to, of course, be aware that persons will be concerned of the wide powers that are set out within the legislation. I was joking to a colleague of mine that it may also even behoove the government to appoint a minister of WhatsApp so as to allow messages which the government think necessary to get out there. Because at the end of the day, when persons see legislation which is wide and allows for those who may seek to criticize or condemn because of the potential utilization of that legislation for a nefarious purpose, the only way to counter such assertions is by informed and distributed information in a method that is accessible, repeated, and easily digested. The Prime Minister has said that politics is the art of repetition. I heard her well. And while I have certainly no interest in elective politics, while I play my part and contribute in this scenario, it would seem that this is one of those cases where the government may need to get its message out short, simple, consistent, via WhatsApp would be my humble recommendation, sir. Now, as someone who has had a recent interaction with the FTC, I can say that the organization itself does exemplary service, and has been given a rather heavy mandate with the amount of issues that they have to deal with. Again, the question of resources, which I repeat. Again, the question of how do we get the right persons into those roles. Again, how do you keep the balance of regulation with government policy? That is something which the government has to grapple with. Now, while we have checks and balances offered by the courts, we have seen recently that when persons avail themselves to that protection and legislative mechanism, they are also criticized. They are also criticized when they utilize the mechanism providing the same legislation. But that's another topic, sir. I believe, sir, that continued education of the public as to the rights and roles of the various parties and stakeholders would redound to the nation's benefit. I think we should give credit. We are now, I think, fully, watch me now, electrified on the issue of renewable energy. Barbadians are now in the do with renewable energy more than any time before. We knew we had it with the hot water. I think we are now fully engaged with regard to the concept of electrical production. I personally have some views which I will tread carefully on, that it might be too late. It might be too late today for persons who wish to benefit as others have with regard to the renewable energy push. But that is life. Persons who have access to information and access to capital are sometimes able to take advantage of the lay of the land. Now, if I may, these are the recommendations which I will consider, or which I propose to assist the government, ever so humbly, you know, the independent collaborative contribution that we produce here, with the exercise that we find ourselves. Sir, organizations like BRIA, I think, ought to be commended for their continued assistance to the public in terms of understanding the issue with renewable energy. I myself have had to go on their website, and I found it very informative and very interesting. The government does have the information portals for renewable energy, but there's a lot of information, and again, making it digestible and easy to access may redound to the benefit of us all. The tax benefits to do with renewable energy, in my mind, are somewhat unclear, but I believe that they are set out to be $10,000 per annum up to a period of 5 years, but I don't think it is as clear as it could be to persons as to how it is utilized upon implementation for a household that is not renting. Sir, the ease of doing business for a renewable energy project, there is no ease of doing business for a renewable energy project, because you have to be able to coordinate with the persons who is doing install, the persons who are providing the electricity from the organization that does it, the persons from the government department who has to sign off on certain aspects of it, and the different licenses that you need. It is not a simple exercise, and any attempt to bring together a third-party mechanism that captures all that will definitely assist. And then, of course, we all know the joy of coordinating with the government departments and the need for more resources and ease of access. At the end of the day, sir, this is a piece of legislation which ties in to the government's policy. And what I find somewhat interesting is that when the legislation was done in 2020, which brought the renewable energy under the ambit of the FTC, there was little public sentiment. But as life goes on and things change, persons perhaps become more educated. And I said, Mr. President, that I would end my contribution on a selfish note. And this is it. Sir, today is the birthday of a gentleman by the name of John Boyce, who has championed renewable energy since 1996. In terms of offering back then, it wasn't sexy, but the way of renewable energy was to reduce the cost of buildings by reducing their consumption. So, you know, we think about renewable energy as not necessarily producing energy, but it's also being conservative with regard to your utilization. And I wanted to take this public forum to thank him for all that he's done for me and to wish him a happy birthday. I thank you, Mr. President.
And I must join with you in wishing him a happy birthday. We both served in this place, in the Honorable Senate, 1994 to 1999. We have many fond memories of our exchanges here, and I certainly wish him the best. And he was always high in my estimation, but he's higher because he shares the birthday of my son. But my son shares with him, he's younger. Today is my son's birthday as well. Yes, great minds. Thank you very much. So wish former Senator Boyce happy birthday for me. Speakers, Senator Hibbert.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I raise in full support of the amendment before us, and I am moved by the previous contribution in terms of the global perspective brought by Senator Boyce in terms of why this amendment is going to put Barbados in full stead and preparation for the change in the environment, notwithstanding the fact that the particular targets, as you alluded to, sir, in terms of COP, are being challenged even more now than before, and there's going to be a significant demand for different energy components such as storage. We do expect that the prices are going to rise. We do expect that the competition for those components are going to rise, and we need to put the government in a full range of flexibility by way of this amendment to ensure that we can move swiftly to grab hold of those particular components. So in this case, it could be storage, it could be something else tomorrow. I do also take the fact that based on the expressions I've read online, I do not get the impression that there is any significant level of confusion, sir, with regard to what we are approaching today. In fact, the greatest level of confusion I would have had today, and it is a welcome confusion because it really shows the independent perspective, is where one senator mentioned the environment as being chaotic, and the previous speaker before that senator mentioned senator mentioned the environment as being one of fit for purpose for procurement, and that caused me to be a bit confused, but I was moved by the gesture of understanding the independent perspectives. Sir, despite what may have been put in the public domain, this bill adds value to the operations of the Fair Trading Commission, sir. Before Senator Cummins was appointed to the post of Minister of Energy, we had a Fair Trading Commission that couldn't even, at that point, have access to something called Plexus, which is a system that is used by the utility to allow them to do modeling of the energy sector. And if they can't have access to some of those tools and other contributions from consultancies that they needed, it means that when it comes to doing heavy lifting like this particular need, that they will be in a worse position to say, you know what, this is the process that we need to go about to get the best value for money for Barbados in terms of energy storage. And this is a very unique competitive procurement process we're talking about. This is not the process 2 years ago when this institution, sir, when this institution went about getting a generator, which is on the western wing. We understand the circumstances leading to it, but it's not the same process of getting quotations, person just sending in and blam, putting the generator. There's a situation where this procurement is being led by the government in the interest of the public, but it has to merge with the operations of a utility to which the government, unfortunately, does not have sufficient shareholdings in anymore. But it is a private-public partnership to some extent when we think about that. It's not a straightforward procurement, sir. Sir, you may get the impression that there was a bit of discomfort caused by replacing the term effectively competitive with public interest. But you can be effectively competitive and still serve the public interest. But you see, the danger of trying to overshadow public interest with effective competition is that it does not necessarily mean the best value of money for the public. It may be the lowest price. It may be the strongest piece of equipment. In this case, if you're talking about batteries, but it may not serve the public of Barbados the best, sir. And that is a dangerous thing that we must highlight. Cheaper energy versus sustainable energy. And while it may seem cheaper and persons may place emphasis on the pockets and how much money you can save by putting in a solar panel, really and truthfully, we have an environment to consider as well. We have an environment to consider as well. And I'm talking about the natural environment. There are a couple of questions that were asked earlier, sir. I cannot answer all of them at this particular stage. I think some of the answers will be rather premature, but some of them I believe I would like to touch on. I believe that the question that was asked in terms of the design of the energy sector earlier and what it's going to look like was answered by the same person that asked the question, because the statement that followed the question was that there are a lot of moving parts and a lot of competing interests there, so it would not delve into answering the question which was asked by the person that asked it. The other question that was asked, sir, highlighted SDG 7 and focused heavily on the statement in terms of SDG 7, 7.1 in particular, which ensures universal access which ensures universal access to affordable energy. That statement was not fully correct in terms of what SDG 7.1 says, and I would like to serve for the benefit of the chamber, read out exactly what it says. It says SDG 7.1 focuses on ensuring universal access to affordable, that is one word, reliable, and modern energy services. And when we put emphasis on reliable, we get to recognize that it's not about only money, but it's about the sustainability of the energy resources that we're looking at as well, sir. Then there was another question in terms of the ownership of the battery, a very, very, very relevant question, sir. Very relevant question. While I am not in a position to answer the particular ownership, correct, I would lean on the fact that we have stakeholders involved or implied to be involved, such as the IDB. And in the usual pretext of the IDB when it comes to matters of this nature in terms of competitive bidding frameworks, from what I've observed, there is a leaning towards sustainability and the involvement of the private sector for the most part, sir. Not necessarily always getting involved with government for the end product to be owned by government, but the private sector to be involved. That is not a statement clarifying exactly who will own, but I tend to recognize that the IDB favors sustainable interventions as well. I do support the call for regular updates from the public in different forms as well. No issue with that. I do recognize it, but I also recognize that the Ministry of Energy has done significantly well in trying to communicate the developments of the sector and the government as well as the Barbados Renewable Energy Association. Sir, I want to just, because it is really non-contentious, but I really want to focus on something that is of a growing concern of mine over the years as far as renewable energy goes. We constantly hear about different technologies, battery storage, wave energy storage, solar, whatever it is. My greatest concern, not out of this procurement process, but out of any procurement process or engagement for renewable energies, is really waste stream management. And it is a great concern of mine. I know that in different jurisdictions, sir, there's an emphasis on establishing an arrangement in contracts so that the providers of the batteries, the providers of the solar panels, there's a take back after the useful life of those entities, of those items, sorry, so that they may ship it back to their jurisdictions, their countries, but you don't leave the waste there within the country that's utilizing it. And some may argue, which is correct, that this may lead to a higher price, a more costly intervention in terms of accessing renewable energy. For me, this is where the cost-benefit analysis comes off, and this is where the economic benefit versus the environmental benefit has to be considered. Is it the better approach for us to focus on the economic and the financial aspect of having cheaper electricity, cheaper energy, sorry, by way of keeping the batteries within our physical jurisdiction, or should we have a situation where we negotiate a take-back clause where the suppliers of these batteries, and I'm talking at utility scale, where they take it back to the countries and don't leave the waste in Barbados if we do not have a sector that can utilize the waste to be repurposed in a useful way in Barbados? This is just my opinion, sir, not the position of the government, but my greedy opinion. I would pay more money knowing that I can keep the environment clean for the future generation than pay less money today and leave the future generation to deal with the dump later on. And the waste streams that can be generated from renewable energy are significant, sir. And this is why the European Union moved 4 years ago to ensure that their efforts at negotiating utility scale provisions for different components in the renewable energy sector. Some of them may not have as significant a waste stream as others, but they all collectively have a significant one, particularly the solar industry, sir. So, sir, I want to commend the government. I want to commend the Minister as well of Energy. Since her appointment in the Ministry of Energy, I can tell you that there have been significant changes, and the mood and the enthusiasm that I felt from FTC all the way back to the Ministry of Energy is one of a commendable nature. I want to commend the government for presenting this amendment, and I want to give it my full support, and I would definitely look forward to seeing us add value to make this government more flexible with these amendments, sir. With those few words, I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Harewood. Who's next? Her Honourable Senator Thompson.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise to support the bill currently before the chamber, and to do so, having been the Minister of Energy under whose tenure Barbados' first national energy policy was developed, and in the context of a person who is formally trained in energy. It is interesting the way things evolve over time, sir. I remember when I decided that I was going to do a master's in energy law with a specialization in oil and gas and a subspecialization in renewable energy and environmental law for the energy sector, and then do a specialization in arbitration. And people, when I was saying to people, well, I'm doing this law master's in all the ranges of energy, people looked at me like, for what? What would you want to do that for? I mean, what would you do with it? That was the question. Those were the questions that people repeatedly asked me. And now it has become clear why you need specialist training in energy, because it is one of the largest and most rapidly evolving developmental planks all over the world, but particularly in small island developing states and developing economies where developed societies have built their development profile on fossil fuels and are now insisting, as we are because of the threat that they pose to our economic and social and environmental well-being, are now insisting that we should achieve the same levels of growth but not use fossil fuels, that we have to find renewable energy platforms. And it is critical in a context where Barbados has such high aspirations in terms of its renewable energy and the empowering of the average Barbadian by giving them access to renewable energy and revenue streams from renewable energy via the HOPE and other projects that are now the policy initiatives, the innovative policy initiatives of this administration. It is interesting that the climate in the international marketplace and the lack of access to the resources to enable this growth and to enable the achievement of our aspirations is in fact residing, as it always seems to, within the developed countries. So once again, they're monopolizing the resources and the means of achieving the goals. And while I make that point, sir, there is another point that I would want to make. And it has to do as well with the international climate and what I see as a deeply troubling national trend. There is now a substantial body of literature across universities and across the United Nations about the growing lack of trust in politicians and in public institutions and in the consequences for development and for governance at the national level. So with an erosion of public confidence, what you have is less and less buy-in from the public, and therefore poorer development outcomes and poorer connection with policy formulation, with policy implementation, and with cooperation on matters of policy to the extent that people are now prepared to vote against their own interests and to curse you for trying to help them because there are others standing on the bylines who have no national commitment, who with malfeasance, malefides, mischief, or massive ignorance are driving a public narrative that you are somehow attempting as a political class to cause the public harm. So over the course of the last few days and couple weeks, we heard a national narrative. Oh Lord, you better be careful, you're causing. The minister gonna have a lot to say, so look out, look at trouble coming now. Because somehow you would get the impression that if the matter is left for the discretion of the minister, or if the matter is left for the minister to act in his or her discretion after being advised, that somehow the minister is absolutely about to get it wrong or to mischievously act against the public interest. When our history in Barbados has been that while there have been things about which we can complain, and rightly so, and should continue to do so when we see things that are wrong, our history has been that by and large, successive administrations in this country have gotten it right. We can disagree on a lot of things, but when you look at where we are positioned developmentally, as a small island developing state without the resources, natural and financial, to which others had access, you have to stand up and applaud. But that is not now what is happening. What you get, sir, or what we have seen emerging, and I'm deeply concerned about it, because there are too many people out there who are gullible, innocent, or just believe that because they see something in print or hear it on a social media platform, that there is some truth on the back of it, on the basis of it. And because culturally, we like to say, well, if it got smoke, it got some kind of fire. And the truth is, it may just be smoke. There may be no fire there at all. So to go, sir, to recent incidents that parallel what has happened relative to this matter of the distrust that we are now hearing being sown about the language of the amendment, with the minister having the discretion on advice to act in the public interest. A few weeks ago, we were told in relation, and this, what amazes me, sir, is that the people who are listened to do not have to have any particular technical expertise or knowledge. They don't have to have any training or understanding in the area. They don't even have to have the terms right. They can mispronounce them. They can trip over them. They can fail to understand what they mean. But people will stay saying, you hear so-and-so say so-and-so. There are all kinds of people now calling the staff doctor this and doctor that are bare Dr. Boobies, sir. No qualifications or anything at all. And they are out there driving public opinion on everything from governance issues to COVID vaccines. And they have no training. But people are willing to listen to them. And you do not know what their motives are. Sometimes the motive is, sir, that they are now getting more attention than they've ever had in their whole life. More attention than they have gotten since their mother breastfed them as babies. And they love the public acclaim. And therefore they are willing to get out there and repeat things. And the more outrageous they are, the more attention and likes and hits and props and forwards and sends and retweets or reacts or whatever they say now, these people get. And we have to be wary of what is happening in a small society where larger and larger numbers are not listening to traditional media or formal sources of news or to informed, educated public servants who have no interest in misleading the public, but are choosing to be led by the ignorant or the mischievous. And some of these people are doing it, as I said, for personal attention, others for political or personal gain. They all have all kinds of strange motives that you don't necessarily know what the basis of those motives are. So now, sir, to a few examples, and if you're listening, you will see a trend emerging. During COVID, it was don't take the vaccine. You ain't gonna be able to have children. Look at all the people that took the vaccine that get pregnant since then. But these people still have legitimacy with the nonsense they're talking. The vaccine was going to cause all of us to become zombies, and black people were going to be particularly affected. All kinds of things were going to happen. You know, none of it has happened, but they have moved from COVID and gone on to the next topic, and other people have followed them. They then, sir, moved from COVID into national insurance. It was the scheme gonna break down. The politicians putting their hands on it, although the evidence was that only one political party in recent times had done in recent times, in the whole history of Barbados, ever put its hand, to use the Barbadian expression, in the national insurance monies, and didn't pay salaries, didn't pay national insurance, didn't pay back money that it took out of the scheme. In all of our years, only one administration for a very short period. But yet this thing about, you know, the scheme breaking down because the politicians got their hands in it. You know, you got to keep these politician hands out of the money because that's what happened to the NIS. So all you try to explain about demographics and population growth and the implications for that and the scheme, people were not listening because the narrative had already been driven by the naysayers. Well, when they get tired of that, they latch on to the child protection. The next thing you know, we were going to be marrying off children as soon as they got out of Pampers. Look sharp, we were about to give them injections that would turn the gender to other than the gender God gave them. And some very outrageous claims were being made, and people were standing up at platforms, open mouth, soaking it all in. They were going to the churches and trying to sell the churches this rubbish, and so on. Well, it was Christmas, and we gave them a Christmas gift. The change in the utilities and regulations, I said, Lord, hallelujah, before Christmas we got something to talk about. And then they started with that we have to be very, you know, you gotta be careful now because minister, you hear the minister? Somebody tell me the minister, and you got to be scared, you got to be frightened, sir. And so on, and so it went on, that the same group now had started another set of national confusion. Sir, we really have to be very careful about the implications of this for our economic growth, for our sense of social cohesion, for affecting policy coherence, for thwarting good and excellent outcomes of policy that are beneficial to the population as a whole, that threaten our positioning as a leader on this issue and in this sector and in this area, that are attempting to capsize our efforts to make sure that energy is used as an economic enfranchiser in Barbados in a way that poor people and ordinary people and middle-class Barbadians can have more capital in their hands than ever before, and ultimately will reduce our foreign exchange expenditure on energy. Now, I'm not saying there isn't going to be a cost in the transition. Let us remember that when the solar water heater industry was set up in Barbados, and I want to pay tribute to people like Dr. James Husbands, who was a pioneer in the field, and at the time, once again, a Barbados Labour Party government, as always leading, Tom Adams as Prime Minister, changed the marketplace. And as a result, Barbados always now comes within the top 5 countries in the world of having the highest penetration of solar water heaters per capita because of visionary policy and because people were willing to get behind it. And the government of the day did 2 things that this government ought to take example from. 1, they gave the concessions necessary to the investors and the business people. I see Senator Malulu smiling. As he should, as he should. And they gave, or is he always smiling? And they gave the concessions necessary to the consumer so that both ends of the market, the supply and demand end, got the appropriate regulatory, legal, and stimulation and incentives that allowed them to enter the marketplace and to remain in the marketplace and to benefit from the transition that was being effected. What we are attempting to do now is to position the country again ahead of the rest of the world. And we have to take the steps that are necessary. And what this legislation does is recognizes that in a rapidly evolving market, in a constantly changing atmosphere or landscape, that a government may need to be nimble, quick-footed, quick intervening to protect the public interest, to advance the public interest. And therefore, you can't have them come into Parliament for new legislation every time. You can't have them seeking permission every time. The technical experts have to be able to advise and say, Minister, there is an opportunity, move now. And that is all the legislation does. There is no ghost of wrongdoing past looming over this. There is no danger of wrongdoing future being created by any looseness in this legislation. It is merely a mechanism that allows a government in a rapidly changing market to be fleet-footed in the protection of the public and in the advancement of public interests. The government is not going to act on behalf of business or big business. That's not what the legislation says. The minister is not going to be acting on his own behalf. He will be acting on behalf of the public, and he will do so in an environment where all of the opposition in Barbados lines up to march every Saturday, or as many Saturdays in a month as they choose. They have megaphones and trucks and public systems. They talk in the air morning, noon, and night, or whenever they choose. They have access to the calling programs. Nobody has stopped calling programs, tried to cut them off. They are on all social media platforms, morning, noon, and night. They have TV broadcasts or live streams. They have audios. They have still photos. All kinds of mechanisms for free speech are available to the public in Barbados, and nothing in Barbados is quiet or silent or clandestine. Minister King made the point earlier that everybody in Barbados connected to everybody. So when you're trying to do things, the public hears. So there is no attempt or there isn't going to be any attempt to use this legislation for any kind of mischief. I want to remind you, I don't know how many of you saw the viral messages during COVID when the emergency legislation. The legislation enabling emergency directives were passed. Oh, social media went viral. I had people calling me, messaging me, frightened because they had seen these messages in which they were told that the legislation was going to be used to empower the police, that the legislation was going to be used to take away people's houses, people's vehicles, all kinds of extreme things. And what I marvel at is that one by one, these lies and mischiefs and rumors and misstatements and false statements and false facts and false fictions and false frivolity come to nothing, and people still run along with it. I mean, it is an absolutely fascinating study in human behavior, that the same people who carry on with the same stories get caught out every time as being wrong, but they still come back again and have an audience. It is as if we are gluttons for this kind of, I don't know what it is. It has to be something in the who we are as a people and how we behave and so on. So I really am concerned about the way this is being cast, because there is no attempt to stymie, to silence the opposition. Everybody is free to talk, and therefore, if at all any minister attempted to step out of line using this legislation, there are bound to be extremely serious consequences for him, or in this case, as it may well be, for her. What we need to be more concerned about now, I think, is what are our chances of achieving our aspirations and the national goals which we have set ourselves, given the state of the international market, and insofar as we have 2030 as our line, our timeline, is it a realistic and achievable objective given what is happening in the marketplace? The rapidly changing technologies, the fact that you cannot get access to battery storage, the fact that we are now at a point, if you hear what is emerging in the discussions in Dubai, where they are talking a lot about carbon capture and carbon storage and geoengineering. So the technology is changing, or the global international policy directives are moving rapidly, even as we speak. And those are my wider concerns. Those are my wider concerns, because it is critical for us to achieve our renewable energy targets in the context of climate change and what it means to Barbados society, economy, and various sectors of the economy and our environment as a small island developing state generally, and as a small island developing state specifically that is in the Caribbean, in what the World Bank has described as the second most disaster-prone area in the world. What does it mean for us if we are not able to achieve our renewable energy targets? What does it mean for us if we are spending $1 billion per year on fossil fuels, with the rising cost of fossil fuels, with what the posturing we are seeing now in Guyana and Venezuela, with the posturing or activity that we are seeing in certain oil sources, other parts of the world, Russia, Ukraine, and so on? What does it mean for us if we are fossil fuel dependent, with some of the highest fossil fuel prices in the world because of our distance from the centers of production and refinement, from extraction and production and refinement, and the implications then of the continuing cost of the rise in energy prices because of these conflicts in various theaters across the globe? What does it mean for us if we cannot take up that $1 billion and invest it, if that is a signal to stop speaking, I ignore it. that's all right, Linda. I'm almost there, sir. What does it mean for us if that $1 billion in fossil fuel expenditure cannot be diverted into supporting the poor and the indigent, into education and the education reimagination and the transformation of the educational sector on which we are about to embark, the new schools, making sure that every child has a bright future. What does it mean if we have $1 billion more to put into road repair or house building for the 17,000 people whose names are on a waiting list at NHC? But the people who are trying to detract from the government's efforts are not talking about how we are attempting to address these issues, and that if we can get the costs, the expenditures down, we can divert our foreign exchange and our national resources into things that benefit the average Bajan, into things that benefit people who live on Baxter's Road, where I grew up, or people who live in Haynesville housing areas that I represented, and people who are middle class but live from paycheck to paycheck, as most middle class do, and need the opportunity for their children. What would it mean if we were able to achieve our renewable energy targets and didn't have the distraction of people telling the nation, oh, don't support it, don't support it, the plan to be wicked, nefarious actions are about to come afoot, watch yourself, the up to mischief? What would it mean? What would it mean if fossil fuel prices were not rising in the way that they are and driving inflation in this country? People complain every day about how expensive things are without considering that fuel costs. Whether you are driving, you bring something into the port, let's say some beef. It has come in from Argentina or from the US or wherever it has come from. It then has to go to some manufacturing plant to be made into a hamburger. It has to be driven there. So it was sailed here on a boat. Well, not sailed, because not wind sails, but it was brought here on a boat using fossil fuels. It will then be transported from the port to one destination using fossil fuels. At every sector of, if you take this piece of beef, at every stage before it becomes your all-beef roti in Chefette or your hamburger, that's a fact. That is it. People don't think about the value chain. At every sector, the costs are going on because of the expense of energy and fuel. And therefore, if we could address that, we can change the economic dynamic and the landscape in this country, if we could get to the bottom of that. But instead, you have people say, watch them, yeah, watch them. Be careful, careful. I know what you're talking, and on and on and on. It really is deeply, deeply disturbing, sir. I want to close, sir, by making the point that I congratulate the government on attempting to use energy in a way that once again positions Barbados as a global leader. But more important, I want to congratulate the government for having the foresight to do what it takes to advance and protect the public interest in this country, and to do so even though there is malfeasance, mischief, malafides, and massive ignorance, and political mischief too. But that's not M, but you know what I mean. Mankind making mischief, sir. To stop the government from achieving its strategic objectives, which are in the public interest. Press on, Minister, I believe this chamber is behind you.
Thank you, Her Honor, Senator Thompson. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to take the opportunity as I close off today's debate, first of all, by attempting to, one, respond to a number of the questions that have been raised and to put some additional context where necessary on queries or points that have been made here in the Honorable Chamber. First, I thank Senator Malalou for his comments and his contribution, and I acknowledge his concerns, which have been well made. Senator Drakes, in her contribution, raised a number of queries that I'm going to attempt to respond to in a number of ways. First of all, on the question of the legislative framework that exists. First of all, there's a policy framework. I did speak in my initial comments on the legislation and on the energy sector overall about the 2019 energy plan. I did speak about the updating of that plan in 2023 and the roadmap for that. Those are the policy guidance. That is the policy guidance that outlines the design of the sector. In particular, Mr. President, the IIRP. The IIRP, if you listen to the utility and those who function in the sector at a technical level, they use the IIRP, the Integrated Resource and Resilience Plan, as their roadmap for the technical design of the sector. What is more, there are a number of technical specifications. So while the legislation is in place, yes, there's also a grid code. The grid code is determined by the technical specifications, and it is followed by those either in the utility or as independent power producers. And you have the existing legislation which governs how all of those things work. But, Mr. President, there is, as we know right now, and we heard the website of the Ministry of Energy being referred to by a couple of speakers earlier today, and that website contains a piece of legislation in draft, which is in the public domain, and so I can speak to it here. It is a piece of transformational legislation that we started working on during the course of last year. We put out in August of this year for public consultation. It has been the subject over the course of August this year up to the end of this year, up to today. It is on the website, the Electricity Supply Act, which will be the first comprehensive overhaul of the legislative regime governing the electricity sector. Contained within that legislation in draft, Mr. President, is a reference to microgrids and the ability to bypass even the existing utility and to have those new operators in the system. It is there for review and for inputs. We have shared it widely with the sector and all of the stakeholders. We have shared it with the public on the website. We created a portal to invite comments to come in, and we intend during the first quarter of the year to be able to go into a dedicated public consultation where, now that we have collated all of the inputs that have been received from the stakeholders through our Chief Legal Officer, we will then have 3 days of public consultation on the actual text itself in its consolidated form before going back to Cabinet, hopefully in the earlier part of the year, and then preparing that draft for laying it in Parliament. That is a public process which will capture much of what was asked about by Senator Drakes. In the Energy Transition Investment Plan, Mr. President, there was a commentary raised earlier about whether or not we are looking at all of the options, fossil fuel phasing out, what are the various costs associated with different parts of the sector. Mr. President, we have simulated a range of scenarios, and we've stress tested them all. We've simulated a business as usual scenario. That's scenario one. The second scenario we have simulated is a net zero target for 2030. What will it take for us as a country, public and private, to reach the targets for 2030? But we've also, Mr. President, had a fail-safe. What will it take as an investment level for us to reach the same targets in 2035? So it is going to cost us a far more aggressive push, a higher level of investment If we are to meet the 2030 targets, we're going to have to be far more nimble to reach those 2030 targets, and as opposed to if we push them outwards to 2035, or if we were to continue with a fossil fuel-based sector as that business in the business as usual scenario. Those are all the things that we have already done, Mr. President, and are in the process of completing. And once that work is done, and it is aligned with the energy mix and the roadmap of the IIRP, those things will go back to Cabinet for final approval. I want to say also on the question of stakeholder engagement, all of those documents have been subjected to stakeholder inputs. I have in my ministry detailed comments by BRIA, by all of the stakeholders on the draft of the IIRP. Ain't even final yet. Detailed line by line, section by section comments. Same thing on the Electricity Supply Act in draft. So I want to give you the assurance that not only are we attempting as a government to do the right things, but we're attempting to make sure we do the right things in the right way and bring all of our partners to the table to ensure we have a coherent outcome. We don't always agree. We don't always agree. We come from different perspectives. We have had, certainly I have had to immerse myself in every technical detail of the Ministry of Energy so that I understand the sector I am responsible for leading. And I am comfortable with the team that is working with me, who is also, right now, Mr. President, I was saying to one of my colleagues earlier this morning that I have right now in my ministry almost a skeleton staff. I do. My staff has worked throughout the year because there's all of this work that has brought us here today that we're still doing, and they have worked through vacations. Sometimes they're on vacation, they come back out, they do all kinds of things, and they're exhausted. And so I have half of my staff now at the end of the year saying, all right, we can take a break, and I have said leave them. Let them go off for a minute. Because come next year, we're at it again, gone again. But this is a team that I have the privilege of leading. Mr. President, in the IRRP, for example, we talked about design issues again, and I want to point this out. In the IRRP of 2021, we had onshore wind. We have currently only less than, we have two at Ashford and one at Venture in St. John, 2 wind farms, less than 1 megawatt each. One is already up and operating. The other one has just turned sod, but it's not yet there. We have just, and I'm sure you saw it in the newspaper, we worked every week for the last, I want to say 7 to 8 months steadily, meeting with our international partners to be able to get the long talked about Lambert's project at St. Lucie up and running. We have now erected, finally, 2 80-meter wind masts, one at Lambert's, one at Castle, and then there should be a third one coming up. The firm that has been working with us to erect those masts has come out to Spain. They were here just for the last few weeks. They erected those masts, and we are working through getting the very first comprehensive wind studies, not for less than 1 megawatt of wind energy, but in this instance, between 30 to 50 megawatts. That is now being rationalized for insertion into the IRRP. In 2021, Mr. President, we did not have hydrogen. Hydrogen is now included in the mix. Why? Because we have prepared, and we just have prepared to finalize the very first PPA and the very first project on hydrogen in Harrows and St. Philip. And you have heard the team from Renewstable speaking about that project, and the HDF team. We also, as a ministry, meet with them every single week to make sure we're working through a range of issues. Now, Mr. President, the question about consumers and the price to consumers is an important one. And I want to situate my response first in this way. Our Prime Minister launched the Bridgetown Initiative, named after Barbados. We have a team of officials who worked on the crafting of the Bridgetown Initiative, pulled the concept together, shopped it around globally. And I'm sure that many of the people that Senator Thompson spoke about who are creating mass hysteria and all of the words that she does describe, if you ask them what is the Bridgetown Initiative, half of them can't tell you. And they care, she's right. But what's the Bridgetown Initiative, Mr. President? The Bridgetown Initiative presupposes that there has to be a balance between the right to development for countries like ours and the ability to access financial resources from development institutions, including those at the World Bank and so on, with whom we engage. Now, Mr. President, if we, and the Prime Minister has spoken about it as Minister of Finance, if we are always on the market talking about our ability to access capital for debt, and the debt is available, yes, but at predatory rates, predatory terms, the conditions are so onerous that it makes it impossible for countries to even be able to use it effectively, then we are back to square one, and our development trajectory is on a downward spiral as opposed to an upward one. And so, Mr. President, the same principles that have been promoted with regard to the Bridgetown Initiative are relevant here in energy. They're relevant here too, Mr. President, and why? If we develop a renewable energy sector that is able to inbuild benefits only to lenders or to investors, and in the long run results in a significant over time increase in electricity prices to the consumer, to the extent that we may have the most RE on the grid in the world, but the highest electricity prices in the world, then we have not done what we were meant to do either. That's not the policy of this government. Even if we expect that there's going to be an initial additional cost as a result of onboarding RE because of things like feed-in tariffs, or onboarding battery storage, as we have heard from the utility themselves, the expectation is that over time the prices will come down, because in anything, there is always an initial capex investment that pushes the cost up, but it comes back down over amortization periods that are reasonably implemented and the terms that are reasonably implemented. That is what we as a government are also attempting to ensure, Mr. President, and so we intend to make certain that we have that balance between the public interest, consumer interest, and of course, creating an attractive environment for persons, both local and global, to come into the renewable energy space. Who owns the storage, Mr. President? That was a question. In all of our discussions with the sector, the understanding is that we expect two things to happen here. The grid code is managed by the utility. There's a requirement, even in the existing legislation and in the new legislation, which is out for draft and for comment, that the requirement is there for there to be a dispatch code. That is also required of the utility. In our discussions, there is no independent power producer, for example, at this stage, Mr. President, who has come forward for anything except a generation license. Don't mind what you see in the newspaper, the intention to apply for a license. They have flooded the newspapers in the last few weeks, principally because every IPP who has gone to the BLPC for a connection or for a power purchase arrangement has been told, if you want to get connected, you have to bring batteries. And so once we started to talk about what we were going to be doing, people started to get ahead of the queue or think they were getting ahead of the queue by publishing an intention to apply for a license. We don't have any applications for licenses in the Ministry of Energy. However, I can tell you that, not one for storage, not one. We have what I have described to you for generation, but not for storage. And so the intention is that once this framework is completed and the team is already working on ensuring that we have the storage license ready, and we have the portal, the ELPA portal, which is already there for generation, is being upgraded to allow for storage licenses, we expect that there will begin to be the submission of applications for storage as well. That will mean that in the same way that the grid is buying generation from independent power producers, they're also doing the same thing for storage. So the owners of the storage will be the same way we have the owners of generation, independent power producers, and they will be independent storage producers. But the management of the generation, as will be the case with the management of the storage, would have to remain, it is our view, with the utility. It's the only practical thing to do. It's the only practical way to approach it. The utility and every independent power producer and all of the associations working with us have made it clear that the management of it must remain with the utility. So there's a dispatch code as well, which is incorporated. What we have also commenced looking at as a recommendation from one of the associations is the development of a dispatch policy. because there are concerns, and we want to make sure that we have incorporated them as to how the system will then be rolled out, and we want to make sure that that is in place to allow for a seamless transition. If I'm the utility and I'm managing the storage and the generation, am I pulling from you versus you? What guides my decision making? So there will be a policy framework around that, and we will have that put in place, Mr. President. Now, finally, Mr. President, the other question that was asked was on the, or rather the point that was raised was on the Fair Trading Commission. Mr. President, last week when I was away, when this honorable chamber met, I was in Portugal attending OECD Global Forum meetings. And in the same way, Mr. President, that CAIPO and the International Business Unit have had their roles evolve over time as a result of international developments, and you would know this just as well as I do. As a result of the requirements of the global community, the FTC, as these sectors have evolved, it is no different. The FTC, like CAIPO, like IBU, like many other entities, have assumed additional responsibilities over the years with no additional resources being provided to them or equally over the years. When we had to add hydrogen, this hydrogen project at Harrows in St. Philip, Mr. President, the IDB and one consulting firm had to come in and do the technical work on a methodology for identifying a tariff rate for hydrogen. The FTC did not have the resources in-house. The same thing, Mr. President, for storage. They didn't have the resources in-house. And so we accept, and we have committed as a government, and certainly my ministry, we are committed to ensuring that the FTC is made fit for purpose, not just in a 2023 Barbados, but in a future forward Barbados in terms of utility regulation. And we expect that once the developmental work and the transformational work has been completed, that we will see a new look institution that is in a position to take us where we need to go. I believe it was Senator Nichols. He talked about 2 years to have a decision on a rate review. I don't know if anyone thinks that the same persons who will speak about how long things take to go through the court system, Mr. President, would not agree that 2 years for a rate hearing to go through a quasi-judicial body is a reasonable period of time. In that period of time, we have already talked about, Mr. President, where I started today, how fast this sector has moved. And we call it regulatory lag. In my meetings with the staff and with the industry over the last couple of weeks, I've used it as, you know, when a car has timing belt issues and it goes forward and all of a sudden it starts to cut out and then it drives it back a little bit and then it goes forward again and it drives it back a little bit. The regulatory lag in the renewable energy sector has been almost destructive in some instances, simply because as fast as the sector can go forward, the policy has gone ahead, but the regulations have to catch up. We have the FTC at this point, Mr. President, and Senator Nichols spoke about it in his contribution, with a decision on storage up to 10 megawatt, up to systems of 10 megawatts, below 10 megawatts, for 4 years. But Mr. President, we kind of way past there. Because if you are piloting up to 50 megawatts, but the IRRP since 2021 called for 206 megawatts of storage, there is regulatory lag. And it results in delays in implementation. And it's not because they have any malice of forethought, but simply because they need the resources. And we are committed as a government to provide those resources. And so I hope that I have taken the time and I have answered all of the questions that were raised by the colleagues. I'm just skimming quickly through my notes to make sure that I have. I believe that the lawyers in the Honorable Chamber have adequately covered the issues relating to the treatment in law in the legislation as it is drafted, the issues of precedent in legislation, the terms of definition as it relates to what constitutes a public interest, and how the legislation works within the context of broader legislation in the country, as well as the principles of natural justice and administrative justice and so on. And so I hope that I have been sufficiently detailed, sufficiently clear on a substantive matter. I regret that there are those that attempted to speak very quickly in press conferences very recently who clearly did not take advice. And if they had taken advice on a clearly technical matter, perhaps, they may have been able to contribute more substantively to the conversation at a national level and be seen, therefore, as a natural leader and successor to she who globally has been recognized as one of the 100 most influential women in the world. You don't get to be that well recognized using misinformation, half information, no information, and no technical advice. You have to come with substance. And that is what these subject matters, and I believe this is what Barbados in this moment requires of leaders, and particularly aspiring leaders. But with these few words today, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the Senate dissolves itself into a committee of the whole for further deliberation on this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honorable Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. All senators against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Clause 2 stand part.
The question is that Clause 2 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Utilities Regulation Amendment Act 2023.
The question is that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Utilities Regulation Amendment Act 2023. All honorable senators in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited.
Order number 1, sir. In the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Chapter 225, the vesting in the National Housing Corporation of a parcel of land situate at Dodds Plantation in the parish of St. Philip in this island, and more particularly described in the schedule for residential, commercial, and recreational purposes.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, this is certainly a far simpler resolution. This matter has been brought before the Honorable Chamber on more than one occasion in different locations around the country. I believe we are aware that the Minister of Housing has announced on more than one occasion that it is the government's ambition to build over 10,000 houses over a given period. And as a consequence, you have seen, and we certainly in this Honorable Chamber have come here more than once to approve, either by compulsory acquisition or in some instances, as we're doing here today, to vest in the National Housing Corporation parcels of land for the purpose of housing accommodation and housing construction. In this particular instance, Mr. President, this is 48.43 acres of land being vested in the National Housing Corporation for residential, commercial, and recreational purposes. It is the area in St. Philip, which is relatively close to Dodds Prison. We know when we think Dodds, we think of Dodds Prison. I want to begin by saying that the Ministry of Housing and Lands, the Ministry of Home Affairs, and the relevant officials from Dodds Prison have conducted the necessary site visits to the area and have ensured that the area is fit for housing development and that there is no conflict between the area to the north, which is Dodds Prison, and the area on the other side of Highway 4B, which is meant for the purposes I have just outlined. The principal use for this particular housing area, Mr. President, is for the persons who have been affected by the Rock Hall relocation program. And so these persons are expected to go into this area, as you would have heard in the other place when the Honorable Minister spoke about it. In addition to housing, Mr. President, this area will also have a green area, and they will have a green space. I think one of the things that you will hear, we heard certainly this last few days in the other place as they discussed planning and development planning in the country, and we will have an opportunity, I expect, to have those similar conversations very soon, that the importance of green spaces included in communities for recreational purposes, but just for mental health at times, Mr. President, is a part of the commitment of this government. And so I hope to belabor this particular resolution, Mr. President. And so with those very few words, I beg to move that this resolution do now pass.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Any speakers on this matter? The question is that this resolution do not pass. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. This resolution is now passed.
Order number 3, sir. In the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Land Acquisition Act, Chapter 228, the compulsory acquisition by the state of parcels of land situate at Work Hall in the parish of St. Philip in this island, and more particularly described in the schedules for the public purpose of regularizing a squatters' housing area.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. This, again, is a fairly simple resolution. We have approximately 20.988 square meters of land, around 5.18 acres. And this particular area, Mr. President, constitutes 7 different parcels of land, 4 of which are vacant. The remaining pieces, three plots of land, Mr. President, have some structures on them, and there are persons who have, and I don't think that we as a government typically talk about squatters per se. We talk about unplanned settlements. I think that's what we call them, unplanned settlements. And so in this area, Mr. President, we are compulsorily acquiring this land in order to have housing development in the area for the persons that are there. And so there was a social survey conducted to assess what actually obtains in the area, what are the conditions of the area, and the findings and the recommendations coming from the Ministry of Housing and Lands were that you should acquire the lands, all 7 parcels of the land comprising 21.062.4 square meters, and that land would be used to regularize the housing arrangements for persons at Work Hall, St. Philip. And with these, again, very few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this resolution do not pass.
Any speakers? The question is that this resolution do not pass. Honorable Senator Maynard.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do not mean to detain this chamber, but I feel, Mr. President, obligated to say something this much, Mr. President. Mr. President, this government is making tremendous effort to regularize matters that arose because people encroached on people's property, occupied it, and were aided and abetted by those in charge. And it will cost the taxpayers of this country large sums of money to fix the problems of moving the people and to fix our water supplies in another area. And I really think that it is fine to have the political benefits of votes in the constituency, but it comes at tremendous cost. And while what may happen in St. Philip can be regularized by moving the persons, what will have to happen, sir, in the Bell, we will all pay for, because we will have to spend large sums of money as proposed on the billboard that I saw to protect the water table and put in the sewer system. But Mr. President, the problem of squatting, and I don't call it unplanned settlements at all, the problems of squatting in this country are real, and it probably speaks to the level of lack of respect for people's property, where people will encroach on property, and the landowner who pays the taxes and are responsible for all that happens has to stand up and fight to retain your property. And I don't know if there's an easy solution, because it is not, you cannot take matters into your own hands when someone comes and puts a structure on your property. You have to seek your redress in the courts and employ lawyers at great cost, and sometimes you lose. And it is something that needs to be discouraged. I don't know if there's anyone who has the heart, any elected officials who stand in any chamber that has the heart to address it in the public, but it's something that needs to be discouraged, Mr. President. It is painful, Mr. President, when you see not wealthy people, poor people lose property because someone squatted on it, or someone had an encroachment, occupied a large portion of it, and when the appropriate time has passed, they claim it. And it's a national problem, and it's happening more and more, Mr. President, and it needs to be discouraged. That's all I have to say, Mr. President. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Maynard. The question is that this resolution do not pass. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The next ayes have it. This resolution is now passed. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I beg to move that having completed the business of the government for today's sitting of the Senate, that the Senate adjourn until Wednesday, December 20th at 11 a.m. Wednesday, December 20th at 11 a.m.
The question is that the Honorable the Senate will now adjourn until Wednesday, December 20th at 11 a.m. Honorable Senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The Senate stands adjourned.